the group finally reached the top of the hill. Before them stretched the vast territory that would soon cease to be just wilderness. The banner was raised, fluttering in the strong breeze. That symbol marked the beginning of a bold claim on that untouched land. The man with the shovel smiled, feeling in his element. All the knowledge accumulated in his past life as a civil engineering student would finally be put to the test. The small creatures, infected by their master's determination, vibrated in unison. They were ready to assist in the great undertaking. He spun the tool in his hands with the dexterity of a warrior. The history he was about to write would not be made with blood, but with foundations. Without hesitation, the engineer plunged the shovel into the ground with force. The impact served as the trigger to release the power he had been holding back. The earth responded immediately to the call. A mystical energy began to map the area, transforming the natural terrain into manipulable data. The scan expanded rapidly across the valley, covering hills and depressions with absolute mathematical precision. Where others saw only grass, he saw the future. Mental projections of skyscrapers and modern infrastructure overlaid reality. It was the blueprint of an entire civilization. The ambitious dream of bringing modernity to that world was drawn before his eyes. The protagonist contemplated the floor plan of his future empire with satisfaction. Everything was ready for the execution phase. However, his companion remained oblivious to the grandiose visions. The swordsman just watched, confused by the leader's erratic behavior. The prospect of building all of that from scratch was overwhelming. Unable to contain the euphoria of the moment, the engineer let out a maniacal laugh. The laughter echoed uncontrollably through the valley, leading his companion to seriously question whether his lord had finally lost his mind. Far away, life continued peacefully in the nearby village, without anyone suspecting the revolution that was about to transform the region forever. The young man woke up on the ground, immediately encountering a strange floating message congratulating him on his success. Confusion took over his mind, as that situation made absolutely no logical sense to him. He realized he was lying in the middle of a dirt road, with an unknown medieval village in the background. A sudden chill ran down his spine, proving that his physical senses were working perfectly. The cold was intense and real, making his body tremble uncontrollably as he tried to warm himself with his own arms. In an act of desperation to test reality, he slapped himself violently in the face, hoping to wake up. The pain confirmed that it was not a dream. He realized in horror that he had transmigrated into the world of Blood Knight. His frenetic thoughts were suddenly interrupted by something that caught his attention nearby. Footsteps approached from behind. The young man turned quickly, apprehensive about who might be there. The stranger carried a sword at his waist, suggesting he was someone trained and possibly dangerous. Under the moonlight, the figure revealed itself partially, emanating a distinct aura of power. The young man immediately recognized who was before him. It was the true protagonist of that original story. The shock paralyzed him momentarily. Meeting the main character so early was not in his plans. That was the legendary swordsman, destined for great deeds and known for his overwhelming strength. However, at that initial point in the narrative, the hero was still just an anonymous knight serving in the rural lands of the frontier. The protagonist exploded with indignation, refusing to accept the verbal affront he had just heard. His companion, however, remained impassive in the face of the hysterical screams, watching the scene with indifference. The swordsman stated with complete seriousness that he had never insulted his master in that specific way. However, a subtle and mocking smile revealed the true contempt he was hiding. The knight advanced over the property, bringing with it the heavy silence and isolation of the countryside. The knight busied himself with stoking the flames in the fireplace, ensuring a minimum of comfort in the room. While the young nobleman trembled under the sheets, his guard instructed him about the return to the mansion. The swordsman paused, considering how his ward's attitudes would be received. The protagonist realized bitterly that the physical reality of a medieval world was much colder than in fiction. Trying to avoid future problems, he questioned whether the official report to the Lord was really necessary the next morning. The knight ignored the lazy insinuation and prepared to leave the premises. The young man insisted with a forced smile, trying to use his smooth talk to manipulate the other's loyalty. But the guard remained unwavering, turning a blind eye to the pathetic attempt at persuasion. Alone again, the transmigrator watched the door close, leaving only him and his plans. A cunning smile curved his lips, for he held absolute knowledge about the future of that plot. In his previous life, the young man lived confined in a small room, trapped in a modern and solitary existence. However, his body reached its limit. His heart suddenly failed, abruptly ending that life. The memories of the new body, however, revealed a shameful past. The former owner was a drunk who demanded vices with screams. He used to drink until he lost his dignity, violently and pathetically expelling the excess. That noble was a miserable figure, known for taking out his irrational fury on anyone who crossed his path. But the reality was now different. The engineer awoke before a vast landscape, far from that cramped room. He found himself before an imposing architecture, the seat of a power that was now in his hands. The knight and the lady of the house awaited him tensely. They expected the usual erratic behavior. The protagonist, trying to disguise his confusion, made up a quick excuse and tried to act with civility. The woman was visibly stunned. That calm behavior did not match the history of the man she knew. The boy confirmed his words with an awkward gesture, realizing how difficult it would be to clean up that reputation. The reaction of the two was pure shock. They never imagined seeing that noble acting with such good sense. Meanwhile, in the nearby village, life went on as usual under the daylight. A local worker took care of his heavy tasks, oblivious to the changes taking place in the castle. Suddenly, the routine was broken. The man stopped working, noticing something that aroused his suspicion. The protagonist walked through the streets of the village accompanied by his bodyguard, observing the surroundings with apparent tranquility. However, something interrupted his walk. He noticed a local worker desperately trying to hide behind a cart, trembling with fear. The young noble looked to the side, seeking to understand the reason for that exaggerated reaction, but the swordsman remained impassive, as if this was routine. It was not an isolated case. As they advanced, the residents fled hastily, clearing the streets as if a deadly plague was approaching. The protagonist soon understood the gravity of the situation. The infamous reputation of the body he now inhabited caused widespread panic wherever he went. Childish curiosity, however, still defied fear when a boy decided to peek through the open window on the second floor, but the recklessness was promptly corrected. An adult pulled the child inside violently, desperate to protect him from the supposed threat on the street. The window was closed abruptly, sealing the house and its inhabitants against the unwanted presence of the noble and his guard. Silence took over the street. Where there was life before, now there was only the sound of the pair's footsteps echoing in the void left by fear. The swordsman finally broke the silence with a direct comment, catching the protagonist by surprise and forcing him to face reality. The young man tried to disguise his nervousness with a weak smile. He needed to maintain his composure while processing the weight of his new social identity. His original plan was simple: take advantage of the title of heir to a rural baron to live a sweet, comfortable life bathed in lust. However, a sudden notification interrupted his golden reverie, bringing him back to the immediate and urgent problems of that world. Realizing that the situation demanded a response, or perhaps trying to deny an accusation, he panicked and began to gesticulate frantically at the guard. The swordsman watched that sudden explosion of clumsy movements with total disbelief, silently questioning his lord's sanity. The swordsman confronted his master before entering the establishment. He demanded the promise of a formal apology that had been made previously. The protagonist maintained his composure, aware of the weight of his past actions. He listened to the demand without showing any intention of backing down. However, the young man's defiant attitude provoked a reaction of disbelief in his companion. The swordsman could hardly believe the audacity he was witnessing. Ignoring the astonishment of others, the boy closed his eyes for a moment. He needed to prepare himself mentally and focus on the immediate goal. The door opened with a heavy creak. The swordsman watched carefully as the young man entered the room without hesitation. The protagonist's gaze turned analytical as soon as he crossed the threshold. He examined every detail of the environment with a calculating coldness. The interior of the establishment was completely devastated. Shattered chairs and tables were scattered across the floor like the remnants of a violent battle. The destruction of the previous night had left deep marks even on the walls. Nothing had escaped the uncontrolled fury that had swept through the place. Suddenly, the young man bowed sharply and shouted. He took full responsibility for the chaos, declaring his guilt loudly and clearly. The tavern owner, however, panicked immediately. The sudden confession of that infamous noble terrified him rather than making him grateful. The swordsman watched the awkward scene with skepticism. The owner was trying to refuse any compensation, trembling with fear before that menacing figure. The protagonist's posture seemed forced and arrogant in his companion's eyes. That apology sounded like anything but genuine. The tavern keeper was sweating profusely, begging the noble not to bother. The dread of retaliation outweighed any desire for justice. The swordsman sighed, realizing the futility of the situation. The young man's bad reputation spoke much louder than his words of regret. Already outside, the companion noticed the lack of relief on the man's face. The protagonist, however, considered that fearful reaction perfectly expected. The young noble explained his reasoning coldly. For him, solving the current problems came down to a single, simple matter of funding. His companion, however, found the logic exhausting. The swordsman internally questioned why everything had to be so complicated and bureaucratic. Ignoring the skepticism of others, the protagonist continued to outline his strategy. He suggested combining the available resources with the current conditions to gain an advantage. The knight looked away, feeling resigned. He realized that there was no escaping the complex machinations of that man. The pair continued walking through the arid terrain. The rhythmic sound of their footsteps marked the beat of that one-sided conversation. Suddenly, the rhythm was broken. The group leader stopped in place, abruptly halting the march. The swordsman stopped right after, confused. He turned around, tense, trying to understand what had captured the other's attention so suddenly. In the engineer's mind, something began to form. An old idea found the necessary trigger to awaken in the middle of nowhere. The inspiration didn't come all at once, but began to spark. A technical possibility arose, struggling to gain strength in the darkness of his thoughts. The warrior observed the change in the master's expression. He recognized that intense look. It was the prelude to another invention or absurd plan. The connection was finally complete. The solution to the structural problem shone with electrical and undeniable intensity in his consciousness. The protagonist's eyes widened in shock. The full understanding of what needed to be done hit him with physical force. It was a moment of pure epiphany. The mental metaphor became so real to him that the energy of discovery seemed to vibrate in the air. Immediately, his engineer's perception kicked in. Physical reality began to be replaced by lines of calculation, vectors, and precise measurements. The mental project unfolded over the empty environment. Where there was only dirt, he now visualized the complex structure he would soon build. The engineer saw not just a ruined structure, but a perfect technical opportunity. In his mind, the design for a floor heating system took shape instantly, superimposed on reality. He knew that this specific technology was a distant dream for most people. The simple promise of thermal comfort would be revolutionary and irresistible to the locals. The soul of his former self, a dedicated civil engineering student, burned within him. The two identities merged, channeling all technical knowledge into that decisive moment. He remembered the sleepless nights and the heavy manual labor on construction sites in his past life. His experience came not only from books, but from sweat and real physical effort carrying materials. The young noble clenched his fist with absolute conviction. All that accumulated experience would finally be used to ensure his success and turn the tables in this new world. Without wasting time, Lloyd spun on his heels and called his bodyguard. They needed to return to the tavern immediately, completely ignoring the swordsman's confusion about this sudden change of plans. The protagonist shouted his first official order with an almost manic enthusiasm. The plan was laid out in his mind, and he would not accept refusals or questions at that moment. However, something abruptly interrupted his momentum. A holographic window appeared before him, blocking his path with an unexpected notification from the system that governed that world. Lloyd analyzed the floating information with a calculating and serious look. The system presented crucial technical details that demanded his full strategic attention before proceeding. The swordsman watched his master in silence, visibly confused. To him, Lloyd was just staring into space with an intense expression, completely oblivious to the reality around him. The system then revealed the harsh truth about the protagonist's current reputation. A negative score floated above the bodyguard's head, indicating deep disdain and lack of trust. Realizing the social danger, Lloyd tried to fix the situation quickly. He proposed covering all construction costs as compensation for the damage caused, hoping to appease his companion. The young noble forced his most charming and harmless smile, trying to buy Javier's sympathy. It was an obvious and calculated attempt at manipulation to reverse the terrible impression. The strategy, however, failed miserably. Javier's gaze remained cold and critical, causing the approval score to drop even further in the face of that transparent falsehood. Frustrated and out of options, Lloyd gave up on forced diplomacy. If kindness didn't work, he decided he would embrace his old and terrible reputation as a troublemaker to get what he needed. The protagonist headed to the local tavern. There was pending business regarding the property that needed to be resolved before proceeding with the construction. Upon reading the document in his hands, the young man was stunned. The contents of the bill were much worse than he had expected. He tried to argue about the damages listed on the paper. Javier remained silent behind him, observing the clumsy negotiation attempt. The owner, however, remained impassive. His posture made it clear that he would not yield to cheap words coming from that noble. The system then revealed the cruel truth. Lloyd's bad reputation was so great that the man activated a passive skill of absolute distrust. The engineer felt the blow. He realized that his ruined reputation was a greater social obstacle than any physical structural failure. The frustration quickly turned to shock. The merchant's attitude went beyond simple caution. It was pure contempt. Without mercy, the establishment owner scribbled his final demands on the contract, formalizing his total lack of respect for the boy. Lloyd collected the paper with a forced and wicked smile. If he couldn't gain his trust through diplomacy, he would solve it another way. As they walked away, the young man let out a manic laugh. The knight beside him just sighed, resigned to this sudden instability. Back on the wasteland, the protagonist wielded his shovel. He decided that, for this stage of construction, millimeter precision would be dispensable. Javier found his master's relaxed attitude strange. This apparent lack of technical rigor sounded like an amateur and dangerous mistake. The swordsman narrowed his eyes, doubting the sanity of this plan. Engineering required accuracy, not guesswork. But Lloyd's mind worked on another level. He knew exactly what he was doing by ignoring standard measurements at that moment. The engineer then turned to explain the physical concept. The apparent negligence was, in fact, a deliberate calculation about material distortion. Lloyd touched on the subject of the past, trying to establish an important point for his listener. The swordsman listened carefully, but the skepticism towards those words was evident. The young man continued his reasoning, seeking a plausible justification for his recent actions. Javier, however, wondered internally if his master had always had that dissembling smoothness. The doubt persisted in the bodyguard's mind, as that eloquence did not match the memories he had of him. Ignoring the other's analysis, Lloyd positioned the tool and prepared for the hard work. He applied force at the right moment, driving the blade into the ground with a surprisingly professional technique. Driven by greed, the protagonist threw the earth with vigor, seeing there the foundation of his future wealth. The pace of work became frenetic and precise, leaving the observer stunned by such manual dexterity. The excavation soon evolved into carpentry, with Lloyd hammering and assembling the structure without pause for rest. The construction was finished in the blink of an eye, but the excessive effort knocked down the exhausted engineer. Panting, he lamented the weakness of that physical body, which could not withstand the intense rhythm of his working mind. The swordsman approached, impressed with the absurd efficiency demonstrated in those few hours of labor. Javier's suspicion deepened. It was inconceivable that a noble had acquired such practical knowledge. Despite his trembling and fatigued body, Lloyd forced himself to stand again, refusing to give in to fatigue in front of his subordinate. The fragile body of the young noble could barely support the weight of the tool, trembling with exhaustion even before starting the hard work. Gathering the little strength he had left, the protagonist let out a pathetic cry and attempted a desperate blow against the wood. However, inertia was merciless. The weight of the blade dominated his weak arms, pulling him violently back and threatening to knock him down. Before the disaster materialized, a firm hand intercepted the handle, interrupting the fall with absolute ease. Javier supported his master without the slightest effort. While the engineer gasped from the near accident, the knight maintained his impeccable and unwavering posture. The swordsman then extended his hand, silently requesting the tool for himself. It was time to intervene in the other's incompetence. While the knight wielded the axe with the naturalness of an extension of his own body, Lloyd specified the exact measurements needed for the boards. Without saying a word, the bodyguard tossed the raw log into the air, defying gravity with a casual gesture. The next movement was so fast that the air hissed. The lumberjack's axe transformed into a lethal weapon in his experienced hands. Javier's concentration peaked. He wasn't just cutting wood, he was applying the deadly precision of his combat techniques. In a split second, the blade danced through the wood. Multiple surgical cuts occurred in the air before the log even began to fall. The knight completed his technique with elegance, landing softly as the raw material, now transformed, obeyed gravity. What was once a rough log landed on the ground as perfectly level and uniform planks, ready for immediate use. Lloyd's jaw dropped. His subordinate's supernatural efficiency defied any logic of engineering or manual labor he knew. There stood Javier, exuding a majestic aura. The protagonist could hardly believe he was using a future swordmaster for basic carpentry. Javier observed his master's behavior with a mixture of disbelief and silent judgment. The protagonist, however, flaunted his work tool with unwavering confidence, ignoring noble etiquette. For the swordsman, that posture was the ultimate proof that the man before him was a lost cause. Lloyd noticed his companion's hesitation and approached to justify the importance of that thankless task. He explained with a maniacal grin that only by getting his hands dirty would the result have value. The knight felt a chill, unable to comprehend the distorted and intense logic of that argument. Determined to finish it quickly, Javier concluded that the only way out was to work fast to see the result. He applied his superhuman strength to the excavation, turning the hard ground into dust in an instant. The young engineer kept pace, striving to maintain the rhythm of the heavy work. The earth flew as the trench took shape, strictly obeying the design traced in Lloyd's mind. In a moment of pure technical display, he rotated the tool to adjust the angle of impact. The final blow sealed the foundation, ending the most exhausting stage of construction. Before them, the structure finally stood, solid and real, the result of the pair's joint effort. The protagonist raised his fist in victory, shouting his satisfaction, while his bodyguard merely watched the scene. With pride, Lloyd revealed the rustic symbol that would represent his legacy and his new brand in that world. The protagonist instructed his companion to check the final result of the work. Javier, following orders, walked towards the small construction, still not understanding the purpose of that endeavor. The engineer could barely contain his anticipated satisfaction. He knew exactly the impact his invention would have on those simple people and awaited their reaction with confidence. On the other hand, the swordsman maintained his reserved and skeptical posture. He still doubted that Lloyd's eccentricities could result in something truly useful for the fiefdom. A gentle breeze ran through the trees, marking the transition between the biting cold outside and what awaited them inside the newly finished cabin. Inside the dwelling, the wood crackled merrily in the fireplace. The fire not only illuminated the environment, but fueled the hidden system under the floor, beginning to generate heat. The small house looked ordinary on the outside, but the constant smoke in the chimney indicated that the heating system was operating at full capacity, transforming the internal environment. Upon entering, they found the old woman lying on the floor. The tavern owner panicked momentarily, fearing for his mother's health, while Lloyd watched the scene calmly. However, the fear was unfounded. The woman, although sweaty, displayed an expression of pure ecstasy and relief, feeling a comforting warmth permeate her tired bones. The son, confused by the situation, touched the wooden planks. He recoiled his hand, stunned, realizing that the floor itself radiated an intense and constant heat. The protagonist took advantage of their shock to confirm the success of his project. The young man explained that this was the practical application of his knowledge, something revolutionary for that world. The Andal system worked perfectly, channeling heat from the fireplace under the entire residence. To the locals, that advanced thermal engineering seemed, in fact, pure magic. The tavern owner was overcome by an overwhelming emotion. With tears in his eyes, he confessed that it had been years since he had seen his mother so comfortable and free from the pain caused by the winter. Javier observed the genuine gratitude of those people and was paralyzed. The reality before his eyes completely contradicted the image of incompetence and evil he had of Lloyd. The engineer reflected internally on his victory. He understood that eloquent speeches and noble etiquette would never be enough to win true loyalty and solve the problems of those people. Only practical results mattered. While the family celebrated the miracle of heat, the knight stared at his master's back, forced to admit that he had deeply underestimated that man's ability. The elderly couple enjoyed the warmth emanating from the new floor. The gratitude stamped on their faces was the ultimate proof of the work's success. Javier watched the scene in silence. The knight was forced to admit that, for the first time, his master's actions brought genuine happiness to someone. The protagonist, in turn, received a pleasant notification from the system. His efforts not only warmed the house, but also improved his reputation with the bodyguard. The swordsman concluded that the young noble might not be complete trash. However, Lloyd internally rejected any label of altruistic hero. A calculating smile appeared on the engineer's face. He knew that this good deed was just the necessary step to start his real business plan. The small cabin now stood out in the landscape. It served as a perfect demonstration model for the technology he intended to sell. The strategy worked quickly. A long line of residents formed in the yard, all eager to negotiate with the man who tamed the winter. One of the villagers came out of the test house, sweating profusely. The heat was so intense that it proved, without a doubt, the effectiveness of the heating system. Lloyd immediately seized the opportunity. He confronted the sweaty man, using the momentary thermal discomfort as a sales pitch to offer the same luxury. With the aggressiveness of an experienced salesman, the young man slammed the project on the table. He proposed renovating the villager's house, turning desire into a business contract. However, the client hesitated and backed away. He mentioned the deep distrust that the residents harbored for the noble, leaving Lloyd visibly offended by the refusal. The protagonist stood up, indignant. He dramatically questioned whether, after such a demonstration of competence, he still deserved to be treated with such skepticism. The young man maintained his firm stance, trying to bend the residents' resistance. He needed to close that deal to secure the cash flow he so craved. Suddenly, an authoritative presence interrupted the negotiation. Baron Arcos Frontera, Lloyd's father, arrived on the scene to check what was happening. The engineer's confidence vanished in an instant. Upon noticing his father's stern gaze, Lloyd felt a cold sweat run down his spine. The Baron made his position clear on recent events. He demanded absolute honesty, refusing to tolerate any kind of cheating from his son. The atmosphere at dinner became suffocating. The young man could only think of one strategy: finish the meal and escape from there as quickly as possible. However, the father touched on the open wound. He directly questioned whether all that erratic behavior was a reflection of the family's financial crisis. The Baron maintained his composure as he cut his food. He seemed to carry an immense weight on his shoulders, but tried to hide it behind etiquette. Lloyd stopped with his fork in the air, surprised. The patriarch assured him that he would solve the problems alone and that his son should not get involved in it. The older man tried to convey confidence through his tired gaze. He insisted that he had the situation under control, despite evidence to the contrary. Those words, however, awakened something in the protagonist's mind. The phrase sounded eerily familiar as he tried to eat. The father continued with the standard protective speech. He only asked that his son keep his head down and focus on his studies. For the Baron, that ended the discussion. He genuinely believed he was protecting his offspring from the cruel hardships of the adult world. The engineer continued chewing, cynical. He knew that, regardless of his intentions, distrust would always hang over his actions. Determined to escape that uncomfortable conversation, Lloyd stood up abruptly. He announced his immediate withdrawal from the table, eager for escape. But something made him freeze in place before leaving. The Baron's voice echoed in his head, overlapping an old memory. The noble's insistence that he not worry about debt served as a painful trigger. History was repeating itself. The protagonist stood in silence, stunned. The reality of his current life violently collided with the traumas of his past existence. Suddenly, he no longer heard the Baron, but rather his father from his previous life. The same empty promises that everything would be all right had been said to Suho shortly before the ruin. Lloyd realized the lie immediately. Those words of comfort sounded painfully familiar, echoing empty promises he had already heard in another life. The Baron begged them not to lose hope, reaffirming his own determination. The son, however, only walked away, unable to accept that blind optimism. The memory hit him hard. The young man deeply regretted not having offered that same support to his real father years ago, when there was still time. Walking down the hallway, Lloyd pondered the orders he had received. Standing still and obeying seemed like the logical choice, but the regret of the past weighed on his mind. His thoughts were interrupted. He stopped abruptly upon noticing strange movement in the mansion, sharpening his senses for danger. Two men walked through the corridors with an air of ownership. The arrogance in their steps revealed that they were not ordinary visitors, but rather trouble. The more corpulent intruder began to speak loudly, demanding authority. Lloyd watched the scene from a distance, analyzing the behavior of the newcomers. Something in the conversation captured his interest. The engineer's expression changed, replacing caution with a calculating curiosity upon realizing an opportunity. The office door remained closed, concealing the tense meeting. However, the raised voices pierced the wood, revealing the conflict within. Inside the room, the creditors pressured the family representative. The negotiation was aggressive, with documents on the table serving as an ultimatum. The Baron tried to maintain his composure, but the cold sweat betrayed his despair. He was cornered, with no arguments to contain the visitor's greed. Suddenly, the door opened. The abrupt interruption caught the invaders by surprise, instantly breaking the atmosphere of intimidation they had created. Lloyd emerged through the gap, observing the chaos with satisfaction. He had waited patiently for the exact moment when his presence would cause the greatest impact. A malicious smile curved his lips. The young man was not there just to interrupt, but to turn the game completely in his favor. Moments before, in his chambers, he had analyzed the situation coldly. The system had given him the tools, and now he knew exactly how to use them. The young man realized with surprise that this annoying interface actually understood the value of his abilities. A mystical energy began to react beneath his feet, starting the synchronization process. The system immediately began cataloging all the technical engineering knowledge he had accumulated in his previous life. Every detail of his academic background and structural design experience was detected and validated by magic. The protagonist felt offended by the coldness of the analysis, remembering the brutal effort those scholarships had cost him. However, the interface offered the chance to convert this prior knowledge into new active skills, for a cost. He hesitated, staring at the options skeptically, as the descriptions were too vague to guarantee a good investment. However, curiosity overcame prudence. Since he had resources to spare, the engineer decided to risk it and confirm the purchase. The integration of the surveying skill was instantaneous, flooding his mind with a blinding light. The shock of the data transfer was so violent that the physical impact almost threw him away. When he opened his eyes, the world had changed. He no longer needed equipment, as his own vision now mapped the terrain with digital precision. Excited, the young man tested the design function, marveling at drawing projects in the air that previously cost him hours of manual work. Later, however, The logistical reality set in. He knew that only his faithful knight would not be able to handle all the construction. The engineer sighed, frustrated, desperately wishing he had the heavy machinery from his original world to make the work easier. Suddenly, a new system sound alert appeared in the air, interrupting his laments and demanding immediate attention. Lloyd narrowed his eyes at the system screen. A new notification appeared, awakening his usual distrust about what it really meant. Upon reading the fine print, the protagonist realized that it was an invocation function. The text suggested something grand, and his mind began to calculate the probabilities. He instantly imagined legendary beasts and creatures of immense power. If luck was on his side, his brute force problems would be solved. A sudden understanding hit him. If the system worked as he hoped, this could be the game changer he so desperately needed. Meanwhile, in the mansion's office, the reality was far less magical. A violent blow on the table demanded immediate attention. The aggressive debt collector intimidated the current baron without any respect. The Frontera family's financial situation made them easy targets for that kind of abuse. The man smiled greedily, aware of his position of power. He was there to extract every possible coin, taking advantage of the Lord's fragility. Lloyd's father paled, visibly shaken. The paralyzing fear prevented him from reacting to that affront in his own home. Suddenly, Lloyd appeared right behind the invader. With a casual attitude, he intruded on the conversation as if nothing was happening. The young man jumped theatrically backward, startling the collector. His unpredictability instantly broke the atmosphere of terror that the man was trying to impose. The baron stammered, surprised to see his son there. The collector, in turn, tried to regain his composure in the face of that absurd interruption. Lloyd, however, went straight to the point. Ignoring formalities, he challenged the man to present the official warrant for that aggressive collection. Cold sweat began to run down the collector's face. He did not expect to find someone who would question his authority or know the legal procedures. The protagonist lowered his voice, reciting the laws of the kingdom. He reminded the invader about the inalienable rights of the nobility within their lands. With a sharp and serious look, Lloyd took control of the situation. He made it clear that he would not be intimidated by corrupt bureaucrats. The collectors were stunned by the audacity. Their reaction mixed disbelief and outrage at that unexpected resistance. Lloyd, however, maintained his composure. The young man suggested that they resolve the dispute by seeking the truth together, challenging the authority of the men. He raised his voice, doubling down. The protagonist knew that the law was, technically, on his side and would not back down. The tension was suddenly interrupted by the sound of firm footsteps in the hallway. Someone was approaching, changing the focus of the discussion. Javier entered the room. The swordsman's mere presence brought a silent and threatening weight to the confrontation. A malicious smile appeared on Lloyd's face. With his armed life insurance now present, the power dynamic had completely changed. The visitors found themselves surrounded. The young master controlled the dialogue, while the knight blocked any attempt at physical intimidation. The protagonist continued the provocation. He calmly questioned who would emerge victorious if the case were taken to a royal trial. Javier unsheathed his sword with a fluid movement. The shining blade made it clear that the sentence there would be executed by steel. Panic took over the collectors. The previous arrogance instantly disappeared in the face of the imminent threat of death. They stumbled back, shouting empty threats as they fled to save their own skins. The knight kept his guard up until the end. Lloyd watched their disorganized escape. The young man knew those words of revenge were just the despair of those who lost the fight. He dismissed the situation with disdain. To the engineer, all that show of force from the opponents was nothing but laughable nonsense. With the threat neutralized, the protagonist turned his attention back inside. The immediate problem was solved, but the real crisis remained. The Baron, however, did not share that confidence. Lloyd's father collapsed onto the table, crushed by the weight of the debt they still needed to pay. Lloyd threw the heavy bag of coins onto the table decisively. The impact announced the success of his aggressive negotiation. He smiled, visibly pleased to have recovered the funds that had been unjustly extorted. The Baron stared at the money, shocked to realize that the young man had used tactics as ruthless as the criminals to recover the amount. The swordsman remained silent, closing his eyes to process the absurd audacity of that plan. However, upon opening his eyes, his posture changed. He had to admit internally the effectiveness of that madness. Observing his master's face, Javier noticed that, despite the flippant attitude, there was absolute trust placed in his protection. Without saying anything more, the pair decided to withdraw, leaving the noble behind with his bewildered thoughts. They walked together down the hallway, moving away from the office. Lloyd began to justify his actions, criticizing the ignorance of the adversaries who dared to challenge them. That conversation made Javier's mind wander to a dark past, recalling moments of loss under a relentless reign. He remembered the weight of cruel orders that forced him to handle the bodies of former comrades as if they were merchandise. The bitterness against the tyranny of the nobility and royalty of that time still burned in his memories. At that time, any failure or disobedience resulted in summary execution by the sword. Back in the present, Javier watched his current master walking carefree, a stark contrast to his traumatic past. The protagonist, oblivious to the bodyguard's reflections, was only focused on awaiting the reward notification from the system. The protagonist smiled maliciously, aware that this was the perfect moment to execute his plan away from prying eyes. The night was deep and silent, offering the ideal cover for the secret activities he intended to carry out. The young man isolated himself in the empty training field. He needed space and tranquility to test the hidden functionalities of the system. Before proceeding, however, the engineer checked the surroundings with paranoia, ensuring that no unwanted witnesses were lurking. With the area secure, he activated the interface. The system offered a random summoning game that cost precious points, but the promise of reward was tempting. Determined to risk it, the protagonist started the process. He invested the necessary resources without hesitation, betting on luck to get something useful for his plans. Immediately, an intense light bathed his face, signaling that the system had accepted the command and initiated the arcane ritual. The magic manifested in the form of spiritual gears, which began to spin violently to process the summoning request. The mystical pieces orbited the night air with speed, creating a dynamic visual spectacle that indicated the complexity of the magic involved. The young man followed the movement with awe, his expectation increasing every second about what powerful being would emerge from that display of force. Finally, the gears came together to form a complete summoning seal, pulsing with energy ready to open a dimensional rift. However, his enthusiasm quickly disappeared. He complained about the disappointing scale of the portal and the infernal mechanical noise that the magic produced. The magic circle ignored the complaints and released a final flash, completing the materialization of the requested entity. To the engineer's surprise, the summoned being was not a fearsome beast, but a small rodent creature that jumped cheerfully into existence. The protagonist was speechless. He stared at the small animal with deep disappointment, internally questioning whether it was really worth the cost paid. The invocation finally materialized on the ground. The result of the ritual, however, seemed tiny and insignificant at the summoner's feet. The creature revealed itself to be a chubby and lively rodent. It didn't look, not even remotely, like a legendary beast capable of assisting in building an empire. The protagonist stared at the animal, unsure how to react. The awkward silence and the weight of disappointment hung between the master and his new acquisition. The frustration was immediate. The young man clicked his tongue, annoyed at having wasted precious resources on something so trivial. The small animal noticed the sudden hostility. Fear took over it upon noticing the discontent of the one who summoned it. The engineer decided to ignore the failure and turned his back. The creature, desperate not to be abandoned, tried to get his attention in any way possible. He made it clear that the thing was useless for his grand plans. The rodent felt the rejection and panicked. Determined to prove its worth, or perhaps just negotiate, the animal puffed out its cheeks, preparing a desperate offering. With effort, it spat out something it had been zealously guarding. The object fell to the ground, soaked and unappealing. The young man picked up the item with his fingertips, visibly disgusted. The viscosity repelled him, but curiosity won out. Satisfied with its gift, the creature cleaned its face, awaiting some approval or recognition for its sacrifice. The protagonist shook the excess saliva from his hand. What remained were simple sunflower seeds, seemingly worthless. The system, however, indicated something surprising. Upon analyzing the item, the engineer realized that those seeds had an unexpected value in resource points. His attitude changed instantly. He crouched down to reassess the creature, which was now urgently demanding its treasure back. The young man teased the animal with the newfound seed. The rodent stretched out, desperate to retrieve its precious snack. The creature began to chew frantically. It wasn't just eating, but processing the material with alarming speed. Suddenly, an intense energy emanated from the small being. The protagonist realized too late that he was in the line of fire of something dangerous. An overwhelming force hit him squarely in the face. The impact was brutal, interrupting any logical reasoning from the engineer. The young man was thrown backwards violently. His body rolled across the hard-packed dirt of the training field until it stopped painfully. Still stunned, he propped himself up and looked up. Panic took over as he tried to comprehend the sudden change in the scale of danger. The small rodent had disappeared. In its place stood a colossal beast that blocked the night sky with its terrifying immensity. The giant monster stared down at its summoner. There was an air of mockery and satisfaction in its posture, as if it found amusement in the other's shock. Without wasting time, the beast began to work. Its paws moved like blurs, excavating the earth with industrial efficiency. With its cheeks puffed out again, the creature prepared its load. It was a living earth-moving machine ready to fire. It expelled a massive amount of processed soil. The material flew through the air like a projectile from organic artillery. The compacted mud landed with a heavy thud next to the man. It was perfect building material, delivered in a matter of seconds. The fear instantly disappeared from the protagonist's face. He clenched his fist, euphoric as he realized the invaluable worth of that ability for his plans. Later, walking through the corridors, he pondered the consequences. It would be difficult to explain the sudden emergence of that workforce without raising suspicions. However, the main obstacle had been overcome. The young man smiled arrogantly, knowing that the labor problem was solved. He moved forward with renewed determination. It was time to begin the heaviest and most ambitious phase of his grand construction project. The vast expanse of land stretched out beneath the mountains, peaceful and untouched. For the engineer, this was not just a landscape, but the foundation from which his future empire would be erected. The protagonist gathered the local workers by the riverbank, imposing an almost military discipline. He demanded that the group repeat his motto, immediately establishing the hierarchy. With the shovel in his hand as if it were a scepter of command, the young man shouted the orders with vigor. He was trying to instill modern concepts of organization into those medieval minds. The men, however, responded with hesitation and visible confusion. The concept of prioritizing safety at work seemed completely alien and unnecessary to them. The engineer perceived the lack of enthusiasm and the laziness ingrained in the group. To him, those men acted like mercenary soldiers accustomed to receiving payment without offering real effort in return. A malicious smile curved the young man's lips as he noted the situation. He knew exactly how to manipulate that apathy and transform it into forced productivity, thanks to the Baron's authority. He declared that this disorganized group was, from now on, his personal construction army. There would be no more room for idleness or slacking on that construction site. The leader's tone of voice rose again, demanding full attention for the next point. He needed them to understand the value of the raw resource that was right in front of them. The young man pointed emphatically to the pile of clay that he himself had extracted with effort during the night. That material was the gold of his project and the foundation of everything. To demonstrate the expected efficiency, the colossal creature suddenly appeared beside him. The project's living, heavy machinery was ready to accelerate the excavation process. The protagonist grandly announced the beginning of the underfloor heating system revolution. He needed everyone to move that clay immediately to realize his architectural vision. The prospect of hard work and the eccentric orders, however, only brought deep discouragement to the workers. Exhaustion seemed to dominate their spirits even before they began the real task. Suddenly, the young man's expression changed, becoming serious and attentive. His fiery speech was interrupted by a sudden realization that they were no longer alone. The engineer spun on his heels, resting the shovel on his shoulder with an attitude of casual defiance. Someone had entered his work perimeter uninvited. A man in fine clothes and a well-groomed mustache appeared, walking with the arrogance of someone who holds local authority. The arrival of this figure imposed a new bureaucratic obstacle to the protagonist's plans. The protagonist smiled slyly, as he already expected that confrontation to happen exactly that way. He quickly analyzed the power hierarchy in front of him, identifying who was really in charge and who was just a subordinate in the local chain of command. The stage was set for the clash. However, while the nobleman wielded a sword, the engineer only held his shovel, treating the other as the first obstacle to be removed. To the young man, that man was nothing more than a cheat, the first of many swindlers he would need to face to clear his debts. He observed the aristocrat with palpable boredom, not letting himself be intimidated by the aggressive posture or the opponent's status. With a casual movement, the protagonist rested the tool on his shoulder and responded to the provocation with sarcasm, feigning innocence about his activities. The insolence hit its mark. The mustached man felt his authority challenged and could barely contain his growing irritation. The young man then rested his chin on his hands, leaning on the shovel's handle, and mentioned the outstanding debts with an air of total disinterest. Silence hung in the open field. The nobleman's rigid posture contrasted absurdly with the engineer's relaxation, who seemed to be on a work break. The aristocrat finally exploded in complaints, accusing the boy of using his men for personal gain instead of respecting the military hierarchy. However, the protagonist just closed his eyes, refusing to give importance to the moralistic speech about the use of labor. He reopened his eyes with a mocking smile, finding humor in the other's attempt to impose rules in a game that had already changed. The young man's gaze became more penetrating. He realized that diplomatic conversation would lead nowhere. Furious with the lack of respect, the nobleman lost his composure and began to insult the engineer's physical appearance, calling him fragile. The protagonist interrupted the insult by violently slamming the shovel into the ground. He decided it was time to end the words and act. The engineer brought down his tool with calculated violence, turning the digging instrument into a weapon of swift impact. The soldiers watched the scene petrified, unable to intervene in the face of that sudden outburst of aggression coming from a civilian. The nobleman recoiled instinctively, cringing and raising his arms in a desperate attempt to protect his physical integrity. However, the attacker's gaze did not show blind fury, but rather a cold, technical precision during the execution of the movement. The metal blade tore through the ground millimeters from the opponent's boots, kicking up dust without touching flesh. It was a surgical warning. The aristocrat paled, feeling the tremor of the impact rise through his legs as the reality of his vulnerability hit him head-on. The young man then brought his hand to his ear, openly mocking the terrified silence that followed the blow, provoking a reaction. With surprising dexterity, he spun the wooden handle between his fingers, readjusting his grip to demonstrate total control of the situation. The shovel, now treated as a lethal extension of his arm, was pointed directly at the opponent, as if it were a dueling sword. The protagonist smiled and formalized the challenge, suggesting with irony that they resolve that impasse through an official combat. The proposal left the mustached man dumbfounded, oscillating between offense to his honor and genuine fear of that unpredictable opponent. Later, the gravity of that commitment weighed on the manor house. The deadline for the confrontation had been set. Javier received the news with his usual disdain, questioning the sanity of someone who challenged experienced warriors without any training. The engineer, however, seemed unconcerned. Lying on the bed, he revealed his improvised plan to his companion with complete naturalness. He demanded last-minute fencing lessons. The swordsman gripped the hilt of his weapon tightly, containing the sudden urge to strike his own master for the insolence. The swordsman touched the hilt of his weapon, remembering what his one and true function was in that place. He made it clear that his obligation was limited to observing, not intervening or acting as a babysitter, especially for someone he considered despicable. The warrior emphasized that if the young nobleman decided to pick a fight with someone dangerous, that would be entirely his problem. Javier then justified his refusal with an absurd logic, claiming it was a side effect of his own martial excellence. The engineer listened to the outlandish explanation, realizing that the bodyguard was too comfortable while he was panicking. With a smug smile, the swordsman seemed to be genuinely amused by his charge's precarious situation. Without beating around the bush, the final answer came cold and direct. He flatly refused to offer the requested training. The protagonist reacted with indignation, unable to believe that he would be left to his own devices on the eve of a deadly duel. He tried to argue, questioning the petty attitude of the one who, in theory, should be there to guarantee his safety. The young man then confronted his companion, realizing that the refusal was not due to impossibility, but to a pure lack of willingness to teach. The bodyguard merely held his gaze with a sneer, silently confirming that watching the noble suffer was part of his entertainment. The gravity of the situation hit the engineer. Without those last-minute lessons, his chances of survival would be nil. Javier laughed openly, reveling in the fact that he was the direct cause of the young man's despair and impending insomnia. However, there was a truth hidden behind that arrogance. The hierarchy of knights was rigid, and he was on a different level. The swordsman was no ordinary fighter. He was about to break the final barrier of power and ascend to the legendary title of Swordmaster. The protagonist insisted, desperate for a solution before the duel. He needed a crash course in swordsmanship, and he needed it now. Javier let out a long, weary sigh. The young master's persistence was becoming impossible to ignore. Finally, the knight relented, agreeing to try. The protagonist smiled, sealing the deal immediately before his companion changed his mind. However, a subtle and malicious amusement crossed Javier's face. He had a very specific method in mind for this training, but instead of drawing his sword, the knight simply settled into the armchair, hugged a cushion, and fell into a deep sleep. The young engineer stood there perplexed. He expected a technical lesson, not watching his instructor sleep by the fireplace as time ran out. Frustration overflowed. He pointed his finger at the sleeping knight, indignant at what seemed to be a tasteless joke. Faced with the other's indifference, a comical fury took over the protagonist. He felt like waking his master in the least gentle way possible. The night passed in the blink of an eye. The morning sun rose, signaling that the moment of the duel was fast approaching. Javier awoke looking refreshed and radiant. Without wasting time, he coldly ordered the protagonist to start running dozens of laps around the perimeter. The young man stared at the instructor, stunned. This simple order for physical conditioning didn't resemble the secret technique he expected to learn at all. There was a moment of tense silence. The protagonist waited for a correction or a joke, but realized that the knight was absolutely serious. With no other choice, he began to trot, looking back with a mixture of confusion and resentment at the mundane task. Javier remained still, watching his master run around the training field. Basic physical exertion was the only preparation he would offer. Lap after lap, the engineer pushed his body, not understanding how this repetitive punishment could save him in the impending confrontation. The young man continued his exhausting run, even though his lungs burned with each step. He internally questioned the purpose of this exercise, feeling like he was just wasting time. Frustration finally overflowed. The protagonist stopped abruptly and accused the instructor of having invented this absurd training at the last second. Without receiving a satisfactory answer, he was forced to resume the course. The knight remained silent, forcing the boy to continue his physical ordeal. Exhaustion began to affect his reasoning. Between desperate gasps, the boy tried to laugh at his own misfortune while pointing his finger again at his mentor. The swordsman felt the sting of those words. Javier realized that the young man had correctly deduced the improvised and lazy nature of this lesson. Even knowing the farce, the protagonist didn't stop. He turned his indignation into fuel to speed up his pace, determined not to give in. He shouted his revolt to the four winds, refusing to be made a fool of silently. The young man demanded respect, even while obeying orders. His feet struck the ground with rhythmic violence. The muscle pain was intense, but anger kept his legs in constant motion. Air was lacking and the body weighed a ton. As he struggled to breathe, the boy's mind began to wander away from that training field. The physical agony brought back memories of his previous life. He recalled the deep loneliness of waking up every day in a tiny, empty room. He remembered the crushing weight of manual labor, endless nights carrying heavy loads upstairs, exhausting his body just to survive. At that time, the only thing that moved him was a blind hope. The worker believed that if he endured the present pain, the future would eventually improve. Suho used to walk alone in the darkness, comforting himself. He promised his own heart that those days of suffering would come to an end. Now he realized that the chance he had so hoped for was finally within his grasp. He grabbed this opportunity with all the strength of his soul. The protagonist's gaze hardened with a new resolution. Compared to the hopeless hell of his past, this run was nothing that could defeat him. The protagonist reached out to the night sky, seeking strength where there was no physical energy left. Each breath burned his lungs, but he refused to stop, forcing his body beyond its limit. Under the moonlight, the young man convinced himself that this pain was insignificant compared to what he had already overcome. The swordsman watched from afar, unable to look away from this unexpected display of persistence. Javier realized with some astonishment that he had completely underestimated his master's determination. With a final cry of effort, the protagonist ignored the exhaustion and forced his legs to keep moving. Meanwhile, in the safety of the mansion, a much darker conversation took place far from everyone's eyes. The Lord confronted his heir, discussing strategies that would define the future of that noble house. The young man listened in silence, pondering the instructions and the weight of the responsibility placed upon him. The father, however, sternly warned his son not to be too cruel in his decisions. There was a palpable tension in the air, as both knew that the chosen path was irreversible. The Lord gave a formal bow, sealing a tacit and dangerous agreement between them. A sinister smile curved the patriarch's lips as he glimpsed the definitive solution to his problems. He walked purposefully down the corridor, his mind already focused on the violent elimination of his enemy. The plan was set, a brutal murder that would be conveniently disguised as a tragic suicide. Sir Neumann entered the enclosure with firm steps, exuding the arrogant confidence of a veteran about to teach a lesson. Suddenly, a sharp sound tore through the air, descending from the heavens and attracting the attention of everyone in the courtyard. The crowd watched in astonishment as the confrontation formed. On one side, an armored knight. On the other, Lloyd wielded only a gardening tool. The Frontera family watched from the stands, unable to hide their apprehension and shock at that absurd choice of weaponry. The knight, feeling insulted, prepared his combat stance, seeing it as a tasteless joke. The young man, however, planted his boots firmly in the dusty ground, treating the fallen object not as trash, but as an asset. With a quick and practical movement, he kicked the base of the blade to lift it off the ground without using his hands. The shaft spun in the air and landed comfortably on his shoulder, revealing a surprising familiarity with the weight of that instrument. Lloyd smiled. There was no fear in his expression, only the calculated audacity of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. While the spectators questioned his sanity, the duel was officially authorized, pitting the nobility of the sword against the rusticity of the shovel. Neumann could barely contain his fury at the disrespect, feeling his knightly honor being publicly ridiculed. The protagonist, ignoring his opponent's anger, turned his attention momentarily to the stands, remembering the recent preparations. His mind traveled to the past, remembering the specific demands he had made for that decisive moment. Javier had witnessed everything. The swordsman had silently observed his master's obsessive determination during the last month. In the silent early mornings, Lloyd endured brutal and humiliating physical training without uttering a single complaint, preparing his body for this exact confrontation. Lloyd gathered the local workers and engineers. The goal was to instruct them on the new construction techniques and the heating system he planned to implement. However, his preparation was not limited to architecture. During the nights, the young man devoted himself exhaustively to combat training under the moonlight. Javier watched his pupil's progress in silence. He noticed the unusual determination that the boy demonstrated in those nightly sessions. Back in the present, the diplomatic negotiation failed. The opponent raised his voice, indignant, refusing to accept the terms proposed by the engineer. The verbal discussion turned into a physical threat. The opposing knight drew his training sword, challenging Lloyd to a duel right there. The protagonist was not intimidated. Instead of seeking a sword, he raised his trusty shovel, holding it with the familiarity of an experienced warrior. Javier narrowed his eyes, skeptical. The situation seemed absurd, but his master's firm posture indicated that he was not joking. The enemy leaped to attack, certain that he would crush the engineer. Lloyd, however, spun the heavy tool to intercept the attack. With a calculated movement, he handled the shovel with dexterity. The digging instrument moved with the agility of a combat spear. The impact echoed through the courtyard. To general shock, the shovel's blade perfectly blocked the trained knight's downward strike. Javier and the other spectators were paralyzed. No one expected that a supposedly useless noble could stop an attack of that magnitude. Furious and humiliated, the opponent attacked again. He put all his strength into the blow, refusing to believe that the first block was skill and not luck. But the result was the same. Lloyd parried the second blow with technical precision, using the shovel's handle to deflect the attacker's brute force. It was at that moment that comprehension dawned on the swordsman. Javier recognized the movement patterns that the boy was executing. The engineer wasn't just digging. He had adapted the refined fencing techniques he learned to the weight and balance of his shovel. Lloyd wielded his tool with a disturbing confidence. He knew exactly how to transform that work instrument into a lethal weapon. In his mind, he didn't see earth or construction. The young man accessed memories from another life, recalling the brutal discipline of military bayonet training. He advanced with a swift, technical thrust. The knight recoiled instinctively, surprised to see a shovel being used with the precision of a spear. Without losing rhythm, Lloyd spun the tool violently. The weight of the metal cut through the air, forcing his opponent to keep his distance to avoid being crushed. The adversary narrowly dodged, cold sweat dripping. He realized that a single mistake against that mass of iron would be fatal. The protagonist then stepped on the shovel's blade, driving it into the ground. He used the terrain and leverage to prepare his next unpredictable move. Lloyd began to move erratically, hopping and taunting the enemy. His mocking posture completely destabilized the trained swordsman's concentration. Javier watched the scene, unable to believe what he was seeing. The swordmaster was shocked by the total lack of elegance and the bizarre effectiveness of that technique. The engineer laughed loudly, reveling in the absurdity of the situation. He was turning a duel of honor into a chaotic and humiliating spectacle. Javier's expression remained frozen in disbelief. He tried to find some martial logic in those movements, but only saw functional madness. Furious with the mockery, the blonde knight attacked with everything he had. He needed to restore his honor and silence that ridiculous opponent immediately. Lloyd assumed a solid stance, holding the shovel like a rifle. He was prepared to demonstrate that his weapon was superior to noble steel. A series of metallic clashes echoed as the shovel repeatedly intercepted the sword. The engineer blocked each cut with impressive technical ease. He created an impenetrable barrier, spinning the handle to deflect the enemy blade. Lloyd's defense was as solid as that of any experienced warrior. The knight locked his sword against the shovel, trying to push the young man. However, he felt his arms tremble as he realized that Lloyd's physical strength was overwhelming. The system rewarded his immediate dedication. The work tool now merged with his body, drastically amplifying his physical attributes for combat. Lloyd felt the power flow through his muscles. He brandished the shovel with renewed ferocity, ready to test his new strength. He knew that this advantage didn't come only from the system. The bonuses acquired through his recent interactions with the Baron and Baroness added to the total. The genuine concern of his parents, who watched everything from a distance, had unknowingly converted into vital fuel for their son's survival. All the sweat shed on the works and the family approval resulted in the most useful and unexpected skill he could have received at that moment. Back to the duel, the engineer assumed his combat stance. The shovel rose to challenge the sword once more, now with real confidence. The swordsman, however, changed his attitude. A controlled and deep exhalation signaled that he would no longer hold back. The opponent advanced suddenly. The blade cut through the air with a technical speed that sought to end the confrontation once and for all. The environment around the knight began to vibrate. The atmospheric pressure changed when he decided to invoke his true inner energy. The swordsman's gaze became sharp and cold. He needed to test the limits of that improvised defense and see how far the boy could endure. Mana began to circulate violently through his energy channels. The warrior's body became a conductor of pure and unstable power. Lloyd sensed the imminent danger. He immediately recognized the signs of the energetic phenomenon that was forming before him. It was the supreme manifestation of an elite warrior. The Mana Heart awakened, illuminating the opponent's silhouette with overwhelming energy. The knight adjusted the grip with millimeter precision, his firm hands prepared to release all that accumulated power in a single blow. He stood up with absolute authority. The swordsman was about to demonstrate the abyss of power that separated a swordmaster from a simple engineer. Javier firmed his stance, treating the confrontation with lethal seriousness. He saw the opponent not as a master, but as a chaotic threat that needed to be contained. The protagonist, however, remained impassive. His calculating mind ignored the provocation, focusing only on the mechanics of the imminent attack. The knight launched into a devastating downward strike. Lloyd did not retreat, raising his work tool to intercept the brutal collision. Javier decided to raise the level. He accessed the deep source of his power, activating the legendary Mana Heart technique to ensure victory. The pressure in the air changed instantly. The attack came with a supernatural force, forcing the engineer to use all his leverage to deflect the fatal trajectory. The weight of the blow was crushing. Lloyd felt his muscles protest violently as he struggled to maintain his defense against that overwhelming force. The swordsman gritted his teeth, applying even more pressure. He was determined to break through that man's improvised guard, no matter the cost. The family matriarch covered her mouth, terrified. The sudden violence of the clash seemed too real for a simple domestic training session. The Baron watched in absolute panic. He feared that clash of powers would result in the death of his son right there before his eyes. However, the block remained firm. The metal of the shovel withstood the direct impact of the mana-charged blade, sparking under the extreme tension. Javier's expression shifted to pure disbelief. He realized that his full strength was being contained by someone who, theoretically, should be weak. The impossible happened. The knight felt the rebound of his own impact and lost his balance, forced to retreat before the unyielding resistance. A wild smile crept onto Lloyd's face. He realized he wasn't just surviving, but starting to turn the tables in his favor. Javier watched, stunned. He recognized the subtle signs in his opponent's stance, something that defied all the martial logic he knew. The engineer's body reacted instinctively. Without formal training, his internal circuits awakened, replicating the swordsman's ultimate technique to even the fight. The opponent charged with a desperate cry, putting all his strength and frustration into that final blow. Lloyd, however, didn't hesitate. The engineer prepared his counterattack with the tool he wielded better than any weapon. The impact was brutal. The shovel connected directly with the opponent's face, instantly stopping the attack. The violence of the blow was such that the reality of the combat hit the man along with the physical pain. The momentum of Lloyd's movement was overwhelming, throwing the enemy's body backward with an uncontrollable force. The young man maintained his firm stance after the attack, completely dominating the flow of battle under the sunlight. The swordsman collided violently against the barrier, completely knocked out by the humiliation and the brute force. He landed inert in the arena dust. The duel had ended abruptly and decisively. The spectators, experienced soldiers, were paralyzed, unable to comprehend the comical brutality of what they had just witnessed. While Javier watched everything with an analytical calm, the noble beside him was sweating cold, shocked by the improbable outcome. The crowd began to murmur, incredulous. The idea that this young man could win a duel seemed impossible to them. The match judge, recovering his composure, prepared to formalize the winner of that unusual confrontation. On the ground, the fencing expert's mind tried to process the shame of being defeated by a simple digging tool. The protagonist simply walked away, leaving the loser sprawled on the ground without even looking back. Lloyd puffed out his chest, proud. He had proven his point in the most indisputable way possible. Lloyd decided diplomacy was over. He raised his favorite tool, ready to teach a physical lesson that words could never convey to the invaders. The first creditor collapsed, his mind blank. The arrogance he displayed moments before was instantly swept away by the shock of being attacked so directly. His companion recoiled, paralyzed by the absurdity of the situation. Panic took over as he realized that social rules had been completely discarded by the young master. The engineer gave no respite. Rhythmic and brutal blows rained down on the invader, turning the debt collection into a one-sided and merciless session of discipline. The remaining man screamed in pure terror. He realized too late that he had cornered the wrong person and that the negotiation had become a nightmare. Even with the announcement of the duel's end, the young noble refused to stop. Ignoring the rules, he raised his shovel once more, fighting against the men trying to restrain him to deliver another blow. The spectators watched the scene in disbelief, questioning the young man's sanity. The silver-haired swordsman, however, remained silent, assessing his master's erratic behavior. The swordsman's gaze became analytical. He seemed to be looking for some sense in those brutal actions, suspecting that the noble might know something that escaped everyone's understanding there. The protagonist freed himself from the arms holding him, imposing his will. With the shovel in hand and the opponent on the ground, he made it clear that the punishment was not over yet. He paused briefly, taking a deep breath as he stared at his victim. The men around him recoiled, hesitant to intervene again in the face of that defiant and unpredictable stance. Without warning, the violence resumed. The young noble returned to hitting the fallen man with the shovel, forcing the guards to lunge at him in a desperate attempt to stop the massacre. The sound of the impacts echoed through the place. The swordsman continued to observe each movement, noting the total lack of martial refinement, but recognizing the effective brutality of the attacks. The man on the ground screamed in pain with each blow received. The beating was merciless and humiliating, turning what should have been a noble duel into a one-sided street fight. The protagonist's face showed intense focus and exhaustion. It didn't just seem like uncontrolled rage, but rather a task he was determined to complete, no matter the cost. The swordsman's expression changed subtly, revealing a hint of tension. He began to realize that there was something strange about that sequence of seemingly clumsy attacks. The swordsman was taken by surprise. Something in the result of that beating or in the noble's posture caused his usual indifference to give way to astonishment. The swordsman's vision perceived something beyond the wounded flesh. The impacts of the shovel seemed to have affected the flow of internal energy of the body, hitting points that went far beyond simple physical bruises. That realization left the warrior stunned. He questioned whether this had been intentional, as manipulating someone's energy through such brutal blows seemed impossible. The protagonist, however, just smiled with blatant cynicism. Satisfied with his work, he mocked the situation, treating his brutal violence as if it were just a lullaby for the opponent. The masked swordsman leaned in with curiosity, eager to discover the secrets behind the strength he had just witnessed. Lloyd, however, cut off the excitement immediately. He explained that this specific technique was not yet ready to be taught to anyone. Even in the face of refusal, the warrior maintained a smug smile on his face, resting the wooden sword on his shoulder with complete relaxation. The young noble stared at that attitude with distrust. The other's unwavering self-confidence seemed completely absurd and irritating at that moment. The conversation was punctuated by the dry sound of the wooden sword being stuck into the ground, marking the beginning of a technical explanation. The swordsman pointed to his own chest, beginning to theorize about the location and vital function of the mana heart. With didactic gestures, he described the flow of energy, assuming that this basic process of internal circulation was obvious to both of them. The explanation visualized the human body as a mere container, where the core shone brightly and radiated raw power to the extremities. That energy, however, behaved in an unstable manner, exploding and dispersing violently instead of flowing with control. The warrior made a circular motion with his finger, seeking confirmation that his theory about how that power worked was correct. Lloyd, however, seemed confused by the modern analogy used. He admitted he had no idea what the term engine meant. Ignoring the noble's doubt, the swordsman clapped enthusiastically, celebrating what he believed to be a brilliant deduction. He glimpsed a future where Lloyd would completely master that force, projecting the young noble's evolution over time. The theory culminated in the formation of 3 perfect mana circles, a stage of power that would require much more training to achieve. But the analytical posture suddenly crumbled. The swordsman, desperate and impatient, begged to learn just the mana absorption trick immediately. Lloyd's fury exploded uncontrollably. Even with 2 men trying to restrain him, the young man continued to deliver brutal blows with his shovel against the opponent, ignoring any requests for calm. The man who presided over the event shouted, indignant at the scene. He demanded an end to that violence, horrified to see what should have been a duel turn into a one-sided beating. Silence finally hung over the arena, while the victim lay motionless on the ground and the guards held the aggressor. The officer watched from his post, trying to process the chaos he had just witnessed. The protagonist breathed with difficulty, sweat running down his face. The physical exertion of the sudden attack had taken its toll, leaving him momentarily exhausted. Catching his breath, Lloyd pointed directly at the observer in the stands. He challenged the man to decide if the rules of honor still applied in the face of the real situation. The officer rested his hands on the table, feeling the weight of the moment. The authority he was trying to project faltered in the face of the young man's defiant stance down below. On the table, several sealed letters were scattered. Those papers, which appeared mysteriously, contained the answers that would change the entire context of the duel. Upon reading the contents of one of the letters, the man's expression turned to pure shock. The words written on the paper shook his deepest convictions. Lloyd took advantage of the moment to reveal the truth. He pointed his shovel at the fallen man and declared that he was not a noble, but the criminal responsible for the real estate fraud. The officer continued to read the documents, trembling. Each line confirmed the young man's accusation, dismantling the farce that had deceived everyone for months. The con man, still on the ground, panicked when he realized his secret had been discovered. Lloyd, however, remained cool, observing his victim's despair. A smug smile appeared on the protagonist's face. He casually explained how the incriminating evidence had been obtained by his ally the night before. The small creature had acted in the shadows. With agility and discretion, the pet had been responsible for delivering the crucial evidence at the exact moment. The revelation was devastating. The officer collapsed in his chair, powerless, completely defeated by the undeniable truth that was now before his eyes. With the enemy unmasked at his feet and the judge convinced, Lloyd remained standing in the arena. His relaxed posture contrasted with the tension he had just dissipated. The young noble kept an impassive expression, carefully calculating his next words to ensure the desired outcome. Turning to the box, he ignored the defeated man behind him and addressed himself directly to the authority presiding over the trial. Lloyd proposed a peculiar condition. If the prisoner was injured by the small animal, he would be exiled. Otherwise, he would only receive a military demotion. The crowd began to murmur, incredulous. No one there believed that an experienced knight like Sir Neumann could be injured by a simple rodent. The officer pondered the suggestion, considering the offer of repentance as an unexpected act of mercy coming from the victor. The blue-haired swordsman and his companion watched in silence, trying to understand the strategy behind that seemingly absurd bet. From the top of the wooden structure, the Lord confirmed the terms, addressing Lloyd to seal the agreement before all the witnesses. The fallen man, still kneeling on the ground, was asked if he had any objection to that sentence, appearing desperate only in appearance. Lloyd glanced sideways with a gleam of cunning in his eyes. He knew exactly how his opponent's arrogant mind worked. Neumann interpreted the proposal as a sign of weakness, imagining himself receiving royal forgiveness and a light punishment. In his dark thoughts, he ridiculed the young noble's softness, believing that he could manipulate the situation in his favor. A wicked smile appeared on Neumann's face. He was convinced that he had escaped total ruin thanks to his adversary's naivety. The protagonist began to walk away, dragging his shovel while the traitor remained crouched, feeling victorious inside. Suddenly, Neumann's expression of triumph vanished, replaced by a sudden shock and a sharp pain that made him shudder. On Lloyd's shoulder, the small creature calmly chewed its seed, having just fulfilled its part in the silent agreement. The young noble threw his little creature towards the blue sky, initiating the next phase of his plan with a decisive movement. With a fierce and determined expression, Lloyd shouted the command needed to activate his animal companion's hidden ability. In the air, the small rodent instantly devoured the seed it had been given, grinding it voraciously. A blinding light exploded from the animal's body, signaling a drastic and sudden magical transformation before everyone. In the box, the officer and the lady watched the scene open-mouthed, paralyzed by shock and unable to process the phenomenon. Even the blue-haired swordsman and his companion lost their composure, sweating cold in the face of the absurdity they were witnessing. The crowd, previously just curious, now looked up with a mixture of absolute terror and disbelief. The creature, now colossal, plummeted from the skies. While the culprit tried to flee desperately in the background, those present cowered awaiting the impact. The landing shook the earth, raising a huge cloud of dust. Lloyd remained firm, leaning on his shovel, unperturbed by the tremor he caused. When the dust settled, the giant beast was lying in the crater that its own body had created in the compacted ground. Observing the result of the impact, Lloyd commented with a tone of sarcasm, ironically lamenting the extent of the damage or the lack thereof. The young man then raised his finger, proclaiming the beginning of a new era and the immediate execution of his engineering project. His ambitious plan was revealed. He would use that brute force to build a monumental road connecting the barony's lands to the mountains. Obeying its master, the giant rodent began to dig the ground with a dizzying speed, functioning like a living machine. The creature advanced through the city, opening perfect trenches, leaving observers astonished by the technical knowledge demonstrated by the noble. Lloyd displayed a smug smile, satisfied with the confusion caused. Beside him, the swordsman watched incredulously, trying to process how a high-level creature had been summoned just to dig. The soldiers questioned their own sanity in the face of that task. The manual labor was relentless, and physical exhaustion soon fell upon them all. The result of that monumental effort, however, was undeniable. A paved road stretched perfectly across the horizon, built with imperial efficiency. Lloyd turned, casting a challenging look over his shoulder. He questioned his companion's vigilance, insinuating that he had carried out his secret plans in the moments when no one was watching. With the shovel resting on his shoulder, the noble resumed his walk. The swordsman remained motionless in the courtyard, pondering the audacious words he had just heard. The smile on Lloyd's face remained unwavering. He seemed to be enjoying the situation, while his bodyguard maintained a serious and analytical expression right behind him. Suddenly, Lloyd stopped and glanced sideways. There was something more to be said, a final provocation to ensure that his version of the story was accepted. The young man's expression suddenly became more intense. He knew he needed to be convincing to keep his secrets safe from that scrutiny. The silver-haired swordsman, however, did not seem convinced. His eyes narrowed, searching for any inconsistency in the narrative presented by the nobleman. A drop of cold sweat ran down his face. The tension of the moment began to break through the facade of confidence, revealing a hidden nervousness. Javier's gaze became penetrating and sharp. He seemed capable of reading the real intentions behind that smile, increasing the pressure on the speaker. Lloyd's heart raced violently in his chest. He squeezed the shovel handle tightly, feeling panic grow under the weight of that silent suspicion. The atmosphere changed when the swordsman reached for his sword. The relaxed posture disappeared, replaced by a combat readiness that signaled imminent danger. The young noble recoiled, caught completely off guard by the aggressive reaction. Shock was etched on his face in the face of that sudden threat. In a desperate attempt at defense, Lloyd pointed his finger and shouted an accusation. The swordsman, confused by the sudden outburst, hesitated in the face of that frantic attitude. The silver-haired swordsman was momentarily disconcerted. The other's reaction was not what he expected in the face of that approach. Lloyd, feeling pressured, immediately shouted in his defense. He vehemently denied any accusation before it was even fully formulated. The young noble seemed outraged by the insinuation. He questioned the opponent's logic with an expression of total disbelief and shock. Faced with that dramatic outburst, the warrior remained silent. He just watched the scene, sweating cold, unsure how to respond to that attitude. Lloyd decided he had heard enough for the moment. He turned his back abruptly, declaring that he had more urgent matters to attend to. His steps were quick and decisive. The young man tried to put distance between himself and the silent interrogation, seeking to escape that tense situation. Further on, he found the team that organized the match. The responsible officer supervised the loading, indicating that the work there was finished. The swordsman, however, did not give up so easily. He followed Lloyd closely, maintaining a constant and silent watch over the young noble. Lloyd stopped in front of Neumann, who was fallen and defeated. It was time to confront him about the stolen money and the consequences of his actions. As the tension unfolded, the sun began to set on the horizon. The quiet city contrasted with the political and financial conflicts of the day. The discussion moved to a more private location. A nearby inn would serve as the stage for the final showdown between the parties. Frustration soon overflowed inside the establishment. A violent blow on the table echoed through the room, demonstrating the anger contained by the defeat. Neumann grabbed his own head, refusing to accept reality. He insisted, desperate, that Lloyd must have used some dirty trick to win the real estate dispute. The Lord intervened with ruthless coldness. He pointed out Neumann's hypocrisy, reminding him that he himself had built his fortune through questionable methods. With a stern and authoritative look, the Lord prepared to give the verdict. He made it clear that Neumann's past actions would now come at a high price. Neumann watched the imposing figure in front of him with pure terror, feeling completely cornered by the situation. Panic took over his mind. He grabbed his own head, desperately trying to organize his chaotic thoughts and find a priority. The tension in the room was suddenly broken when the door burst open, hit by a violent kick. Lloyd entered the room with firm and decisive steps, surprising the occupants who did not expect to be found so soon. The young noble displayed a confident and provocative smile, aware that his dramatic entrance had completely destabilized his opponent's plan. Lloyd continued smiling and thanks for you subscribing to the channel and commenting saying you made it to this part of the video. Neumann, upon seeing Lloyd, entered a state of absolute shock. Cold sweat ran down his face as the realization of his defeat began to sink in. "No! Run! Let's run away!" the lackey shouted in despair, trying to push the knight in black armor in a futile attempt to escape his inevitable fate. With no time for hesitation, the imposing warrior in the black cloak grabbed the desperate man. With a powerful thrust, he prepared for a vertical escape. Smash! The wall of the inn exploded in splinters of wood and stone as the knight jumped through it, carrying Neumann as if he were a light burden. They crossed the night air like a dark blur, leaving behind the trail of destruction of the shattered window as they tried to gain distance in the alley. The knight's face, marked by deep scars, remained icy and focused. He showed no fear, only a dark determination to fulfill his mission. However, the path was blocked by a metallic gleam. A sharp blade appeared in the field of vision, preventing any further advance. Swing! With a fluid and precise movement, Javier unsheathed his sword, cutting through the air with a speed that defied human eyes. Under the light of the full moon, Javier positioned himself with lethal elegance. "If you refuse, I will see you as a co-conspirator," he declared, with the tip of his sword dictating the end of the line. The silver-haired swordsman narrowed his eyes. He realized that the situation was unfolding exactly as his master, Lloyd, had predicted. Neumann, now unmasked, abandoned any pretense of honor. As the civilians panicked behind him, the traitor prepared for combat. The man's expression hardened, revealing his true nature. There was no more room for negotiations or escapes, only violence remained. A sinister energy crackled in his hand. Neumann revealed himself to be not just a simple warrior, but someone capable of manipulating offensive dark magic. Lloyd watched the scene through the rubble of the broken window. The young nobleman remained attentive, assessing the danger his ally was about to face. The swordsman found himself face to face with the power of a dark enchanter. The atmosphere weighed down with the static electricity of hostile magic. Suddenly, an invisible force struck him. The warrior struggled to stay on his feet as the gravitational magic tried to crush him against the ground. However, even under crushing pressure, a defiant smile appeared on his face. He didn't seem intimidated by the opponent's power. With an explosive movement, the swordsman brandished his blade upwards. The physical force and aura of his blow were enough to tear through the magic that held him. The gravitational pressure dissipated around his sword. The warrior regained his posture, proving that his technique could rival the supernatural. The battlefield was isolated by a dome of vibrant energy. Within that danger zone, the swordsman stood firm, ready for the next attack. Newman reached out again, in disbelief. He couldn't accept that a mere human with a sword had resisted his spell. Hatred took over the mage, who desired only the death of his adversary. He concentrated all his remaining power into a single mental command. The earth trembled violently beneath the swordsman's feet. Gravity increased exponentially, forcing him to use all his physical strength to avoid being flattened. However, sweat began to run down Neumann's face. Fear arose in his eyes as he realized that despite all the effort, his opponent continued to resist. The silver-haired swordsman focused his inner energy, his gaze focused and lethal. He decided it was time to stop holding back. The mana heart in his chest reacted instantly, pulsing with an intense light. The accumulated magic reached the critical point, ready to be released. With a precise movement, he unleashed a devastating blow. The blade cut through the air, projecting a wave of force that swept through the room with violence. The warrior maintained a cold and impassive expression after the attack. For him, that overwhelming demonstration of power was just a natural consequence of his ability. The opponent watched, paralyzed. Cold sweat ran down his face as he realized, too late, the abysmal difference in power between them. The force of the impact was relentless, throwing the man through the air. He flew uncontrollably, unable to offer any physical or magical resistance to that onslaught. The swordsman advanced slowly towards his fallen prey. The man on the ground recoiled in absolute panic, terror taking over his movements. In his desperate flight, he collided against the barrels, cornered. There was nowhere else to run. The predator had reached him and did not intend to let him escape. The tip of the sword rose, pointing directly at the defenseless target. The man screamed, certain that his end had come at that moment under the merciless blade. However, Lloyd suddenly appeared, placing himself between the sword and the victim. He opened his arms, determined to prevent the summary execution at that moment. The young nobleman shouted urgently, reprimanding the excessive violence. The situation had spiraled completely out of control, and he needed to set limits immediately. The swordsman stopped, caught by surprise by the risky intrusion. He stared at Lloyd in disbelief, trying to understand the audacity of that protective gesture. Lloyd, however, did not back down an inch. Even sweating cold in the face of imminent danger, he maintained a firm gaze, determined to resolve the conflict in another way. Night fell over the city, bringing an apparent calm after the turmoil. Under the moonlight, the violent events gave way to more discreet negotiations. The prisoner, now tied up and trembling, listened to the final proposal. He had no choice but to accept the terms imposed by the young nobleman to ensure his survival. Neumann, tied up and trembling, could barely process the situation. Before him, Lloyd spoke about a contract, while the swordsman watched in the background. The prisoner stammered, trying to understand the nature of the agreement. The nobleman smiled with a disarming lightness. He gestured, presenting the situation not as a punishment, but as an unmissable opportunity he was offering. Neumann sweated cold, staring at the boy with distrust. The proposal sounded strange, and the fear of a trap showed in his fixed and nervous gaze. Leaning over the table, Lloyd maintained a friendly expression. The prisoner, clinging to a thread of hope, asked tremulously if that meant he would really be forgiven. Lloyd's smile widened. With the utmost naturalness, he confirmed the pardon, casually mentioning that the debt would be paid after a mere 520 years of work. Neumann's face froze into a mask of shock. The absurd number hit his ears like a sentence, instantly undoing any relief he had felt. The protagonist seemed immensely satisfied. He rested his chin on his hands, observing the reaction of his acquisition with the look of someone who had just closed a lucrative deal. The knight tried to force a smile, but the panic was evident. He was cornered, tied to the chair, and completely at the mercy of his captor's distorted logic. Without wasting time, Lloyd prepared the pen to formalize the agreement. He guaranteed that the pardon was assured, ignoring the growing terror of his interlocutor. With a smooth movement, the young nobleman slid the document across the table. The paper stopped in front of the tied man, containing the written terms of his long servitude. Neumann lowered his eyes to the contract. He read the imposed conditions, realizing that his life now belonged entirely to the one who had defeated him. Lloyd's smile remained unwavering. He emphasized the details of the agreement with a gesture, acting as if he were granting a great benefit instead of a condemnation. Neumann's soul seemed to leave his body. His eyes became empty and tired as he understood the magnitude of the time he would have to sacrifice. The protagonist maintained his radiant and confident posture. He enthusiastically reaffirmed that, at the end of that endless period, all pending issues would be resolved. Neumann's mind completely collapsed. The horror of the prospect of centuries of forced labor left him in a state of absolute shock, his face deformed by terror. The silver-haired swordsman watched the scene, unable to hide his shock at the noble's attitude. The brutality of the previous moment seemed to have been just the beginning. Lloyd, on the other hand, could barely contain a wicked smile. He showed obvious satisfaction in realizing that he had total control over his opponent's destiny. Without any ceremony, the young man forced a potion down the throat of the tied-up prisoner. The priority was to ensure that his new tool survived to pay the debt. While the swordsman's companion shouted in protest against that barbarity, Lloyd remained impassive, facing the other's indignation with absolute indifference. The audacity of that act left the witness paralyzed. It was difficult to process the level of shamelessness that the young noble exhibited without the slightest remorse. With no other way out, Neumann wept copiously as he signed the document. The pen trembled in his hand, sealing his fate under the relentless terms of the contract. With the matter resolved in the arena, the group departed. The carriage followed its path along the dirt road, taking them back to the Baron's domains. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was heavy. While Neumann remained tied and gagged in a corner, Lloyd chatted casually with the swordsman, ignoring the general discomfort. The brown-haired knight sighed, exhausted. Living with Lloyd's chaotic and manipulative personality required a patience he no longer had. The journey took them through the rural landscapes of the territory. The mountains and green fields seemed peaceful, contrasting with the turmoil that was about to begin. A notice had been posted, promising a generous salary for workers. The offer of gold was the perfect bait to attract the attention of the people. The plan worked. A long line of men formed in front of the recruitment table, with the murmur of the crowd filling the air as they waited their turn. Lloyd's assistant questioned the logic of that, remembering that those people detested the young master. Lloyd, however, knew that hatred didn't pay the bills. Closing his eyes serenely, the noble explained his reasoning. He understood that financial need spoke louder than any old resentment. With a cunning look, Lloyd concluded his thought. He had manipulated the situation perfectly, guaranteeing the necessary labor despite his terrible reputation. Lloyd stared at the pile of documents in front of him, feeling the weight of financial reality begin to tighten. Javier watched his master carefully, noticing the sudden change in behavior and the obvious nervousness. The young noble looked away, avoiding direct eye contact while his mind worked frantically in search of a way out. The swordsman maintained a polite and patient smile, awaiting the explanation that would inevitably come. In a gesture of total lack of dignity, Lloyd bowed deeply, thanking and begging with theatrical exaggeration. He raised his face, sweating cold, and began to babble a hasty justification for his behavior. Lloyd tried to divert the focus of the conversation, mentioning the neighboring lands of Lacona as part of his explanation. Suddenly, an epiphany struck the noble. His eyes stared into space as he connected the dots of a new scheme. Greed took over his thoughts. He decided to use travel expenses as an excuse to inflate costs and recover his previous losses. Lloyd couldn't contain manic laughter as he imagined the profit. Beside him, Javier watched the scene with a mixture of shame and worry. With a cunning smile and his finger raised, the young man explained the distorted logic behind his financial plan. The silver-haired knight remained silent, internally judging the dubious morality and sanity of his lord. Later, at the top of the hill and holding his shovel, Lloyd called Javier's attention as they watched the valley. The swordsman turned quickly, confused and surprised by the strange insinuation that the noble had just made. Lloyd smiled ambitiously as he assessed the forest. He concluded that the wood available there would not be enough for the magnitude of his plans. Javier watched the noble with a look full of skepticism. His master's sudden change in behavior always brought a bad feeling. Ignoring the obvious doubt of his bodyguard, Lloyd continued to walk through the forest, insisting on explaining the logic behind his recent actions. Upon reaching their destination, the plan was finally revealed. The young noble pointed to the excavation ahead, declaring that the true wealth of those lands would come from coal mining. The prospect of profit made Lloyd lose his composure. He burst into manic laughter, imagining the fortune that Black Earth would bring. Javier was stunned, sweating cold in the face of his master's twisted cunning. That level of planning was as brilliant as it was frightening. However, the swordsman instinctively recoiled when Lloyd's mood changed in an instant. The noble noticed the hesitation and cast a stern look back. Lloyd confronted the harsh reality of their situation. He reminded his companion that, without drastic measures, they would never be able to deal with the accumulated debts. Javier remained silent, unable to refute the argument. The financial pressure was an undeniable fact that tied their hands. The noble resumed walking, confident. He explained that there was a loophole in the situation, an opportunity created specifically by the current circumstances. The silver-haired knight listened attentively. He understood that the strategy depended entirely on his opponent's ignorance of the potential of that location. Lloyd walked with the certainty of someone who had already won. He assured Javier that he knew his opponent's patterns and that everything would occur as predicted. In Lloyd's mind, the engineering necessary for the extraction was already designed. He visualized the machines drilling into the ground and revealing the hidden resources. With a shout of enthusiasm, Lloyd raised his shovel to the sky. He declared that this was the work they had to do to save the territory. The young noble assumed a triumphant stance, holding his tool as if it were a legendary weapon. The grand plan was finally in motion. The mine entrance awaited silently. That hole in the ground would be the starting point for Lloyd's ambitious undertaking. The mine entrance was completely blocked by rubble, representing the first physical obstacle to Lloyd's ambitions. The darkness of the tunnel seemed infinite, concealing the dangers that lurked silently in the depths of the earth. Suddenly, the silence was broken. A segmented and grotesque paw slid out of the shadows. The sound of multiple limbs scraping against the stone echoed through the corridor, announcing the arrival of something larger. Red eyes gleamed in the darkness. The place was not just abandoned, it was infested with predators. An entire colony of giant ants revealed itself, acting as monstrous guardians of that underground. Lloyd, however, maintained his composure in the face of the beasts. He clasped his hands together, preparing to activate a specific system skill. Green magic circles enveloped him. Although he lamented the lack of offensive combat powers, he began the activation process. A pillar of light rose to the heavens. Lloyd recognized that despite the boredom, this engineering skill was superior to any undead summoning. The beam of energy pierced the clouds, consuming the reputation points he had arduously accumulated with his recent actions. The light connected the sky to the earth, sweeping the entire area to collect essential topographic data of the terrain. An imposing vision of modern skyscrapers emerged behind him, symbolizing the advanced civil engineering knowledge he brought with him. The grandeur of the beam, however, contrasted with the monotonous reality. Lloyd was hunched over a table, tracing magic lines with his finger. The skill allowed him to draw blueprints and maps with absolute precision, automating the technical work on paper. Exhausted and bored by the repetition, he leaned back in his chair, complaining about how long this bureaucratic process was taking. Lloyd refused to rely on manual labor alone again. Sitting at the table, he praised the efficiency of his skill as he drew new plans on paper. Taking advantage of the accumulated resources, he initiated a sequence of improvements. His planning and surveying skills rapidly evolved from basic to intermediate level. Later, in front of the collapsed mine entrance, the young noble assessed the obstacle. He concluded that he needed to find a way to dig through that barrier of stones. Focusing his energy, Lloyd activated his special vision. His eyes glowed intensely as the system began scanning the unstable area. The skill allowed him to see through solid rock up to 5 meters deep. With the internal structure revealed, he realized he could chart a safe route. However, he knew he needed more speed. Walking alone at night, Lloyd stopped to reflect on how to optimize the work process. The image of a creature sleeping comfortably came to his mind, contrasting with the urgency and effort that the situation demanded. It was then that an idea occurred to him. His expression became calculating as he considered a new possibility provided by the system to solve his problem. He accessed the random summoning menu. With enough reputation points accumulated, he decided it was worth risking a try on the Wheel of Fortune. Sitting on the stone pavement, Lloyd initiated the process. A green magic circle appeared in the darkness, spinning with a chaotic energy before him. From the center of the light, a form began to materialize. A rounded silhouette, adorned with a large bow, emerged floating in the air. The creature revealed itself completely, displaying large eyes and an innocent smile as the summoning magic reached its peak. The ritual ended abruptly. The small pink sphere lost its magical support and fell to the ground with a wet thud in front of its summoner. Far from being hurt, the creature bounced happily. It seemed full of energy, emitting high-pitched, repetitive sounds to attract attention. Lloyd stared at the result of his gamble with deep distrust. He analyzed the fluffy creature, mentally questioning whether it hid any danger behind its harmless appearance. Lloyd needed to confirm the maintenance cost of that magical help. When he asked if sunflower seeds would suffice, the little creature promptly confirmed with a nod. The young noble smiled, satisfied with the negotiation. That was an incredibly low price for the kind of heavy lifting he was about to demand. The creature vibrated with joy, delighted with the offer. Apparently, the prospect of easy food was enough motivation to seal that unusual partnership. Both of their attention turned to the mine entrance. The blockage of stones and earth that prevented progress would be the first real test for the new ally. Without hesitation, the animal advanced against the rubble with a voracious appetite. It began to devour the massive rocks blocking the tunnel as if they were mere snacks. In moments, the creature's body swelled, processing the enormous amount of material ingested. A system window popped up, warning that a special ability was being activated. Lloyd recoiled, surprised by the animal's sudden physical reaction. The digestion process seemed to be about to expel something with alarming force and speed. Meanwhile, the silver-haired swordsman continued with his solitary training. He wielded his blade, focused on honing his technique, oblivious to the chaos that was forming. Suddenly, the creature began firing bursts of energy and processed material. What was once useless rubble was converted into swift projectiles launched in succession. The swordsman reacted on instinct, intercepting the shots. He turned the barrage of projectiles into a precision exercise, cutting each one in the air with swift blows. The coordinated effort fueled an improvised production line. Blacksmiths took advantage of the refined materials and the frenetic pace to forge new equipment in record time. The silver-haired warrior continued to move without pause. Sweat dripped down his face as he maintained the intensity needed to keep up with the demand of that operation. Lloyd took on the role of foreman, shouting orders to maintain the pace. With the shovel over his shoulders, he ensured that no one slowed down in that brutal work. The insane strategy worked, clearing the way for the rails. The group advanced into the depths of the mine, pushing the cart with renewed vigor. At the end of the stage, the young noble was exhausted. He wiped the sweat from his face, feeling the weight of the physical effort, but satisfied to have overcome the initial obstacle. Lloyd and Javier stopped for a moment, exhausted from the physical exertion. The conversation, however, took a more serious and demanding turn. The young noble listened to the continuous reprimand. The message was clear. His physical presence at the workplace was mandatory. He endured the criticism about his previous lack of commitment. Lloyd kept a closed expression, only absorbing the harsh words about his conduct. Suddenly, something changed in his perception. The familiar green glow illuminated his gaze when his special ability awakened. The internal structure of the mine revealed itself before him. The system mapped the layers of rock and minerals hidden in the cave walls. With the obstacle removed, the mood changed instantly. Lloyd raised his shovel in triumph, leading the workers in a euphoric celebration of the progress. He did not hesitate to show affection for the little summoned creature. The success of that endeavor was entirely due to the animal's work. Taking advantage of the moment of high morale, Lloyd issued the next order. It was time to expand the mining area immediately. However, his words died in his throat. A sudden sense of danger abruptly interrupted him, freezing his reaction. He turned slowly to the stone wall in front of him. The silence in the cave seemed to hide something sinister. Cold sweat ran down his face. Lloyd's sudden tension was noticed by the workers, who exchanged glances of confusion and fear. He forced his vision to penetrate the darkness. He needed to confirm what his instincts were screaming, activating the scan once again with urgency. The interface confirmed his worst fears. There was a structural anomaly there, a hidden void that the system detected too late. The visual warning flashed at maximum alert. The rock was not only hollow, something was breaking through the barrier at that very second. Chaos exploded along with the wall. A monstrous creature burst from the rock, throwing Lloyd and Javier violently away with the impact. The creature's sudden attack forced Lloyd to retreat awkwardly, narrowly escaping the lethal jaws. The tranquility of the mine was shattered in an instant. Javier, ever alert, sensed the imminent danger before anyone else. His combat instincts took over, preparing him for the unknown threat. The swordsman immediately placed himself between his master and the monstrosity. He faced the giant ant without hesitation, serving as the first and last line of defense. Driven by adrenaline, Lloyd didn't stand still waiting to be saved. He brandished his shovel with full force, shouting in a mixture of fear and primal fury. The metal of the tool collided violently against the creature's exoskeleton. The young man put all his weight into the blow, determined to crush the invader. With a brutal movement, he drove the shovel into the giant insect's head. The blow was lethal, splattering the beast's fluids on the mine floor and silencing the monster. Panting and covered in sweat, Lloyd tried to understand what had just happened. That creature was not in his knowledge of the future, which left him deeply disturbed and confused. The victory was short-lived, as the darkness of the tunnel revealed a greater horror. Dozens of red eyes gleamed in the opening of the wall, indicating that this was just the scout of an army. A swarm of giant ants burst from the hole, thirsty for blood. The mine, once a workplace, instantly transformed into a nest of lethal predators. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Lloyd ordered everyone's immediate retreat. The workers, terrified by the horde, didn't need to be told twice before running for their lives. While the group fled, Javier stayed behind to hold back the enemy advance. His blade danced in the air, cutting down the beast that tried to pursue the defenseless miners. Lloyd ran with the others, but his mind worked frantically. He knew he needed to find a drastic solution before they were all slaughtered in the narrow tunnels. The swordsman, despite his formidable skill, began to feel the pressure of the overwhelming number of enemies. The situation seemed impossible to contain with steel and technique alone. The group shot through the rails, desperately seeking the exit. Lloyd, however, quickly calculated the tunnel's resistance, formulating a risky plan involving explosives. To bring the swordsman back to reality and focus him on the plan, Lloyd slapped him sharply across the face. There was no time for doubts or hesitations at that critical moment. Javier intercepted the giant ant's attack, his blades colliding with a shrill metallic sound. The monster's strength demanded all his defensive concentration to avoid being crushed. The physical exertion was immense. The swordsman shouted as he repelled the creature, feeling the weight of the battle fall on his shoulders as sweat poured down. Meanwhile, Lloyd carefully observed the composition of the walls around him. He realized that they were surrounded by veins of black coal. A sudden understanding lit up his mind like lightning. The young noble connected the geological facts and glimpsed a dangerous, yet viable strategy. Without wasting time, he reached out and snatched a torch attached to the mine wall. The fire would be the essential tool for the risky plan he had just formulated. Lloyd brandished the torch and ordered a drastic change of tactics. Instead of retreating to safety, they would advance directly into the heart of the ant nest. The silver-haired swordsman widened his eyes, astonished. The order seemed suicidal and contradicted any instinct for self-preservation at that critical moment. However, Javier decided to trust his master's madness. He advanced, slashing the ants that blocked the way with lethal precision, opening a passage. The pair ran into the depths of the cave with renewed determination. Lloyd led the way with the torch, ignoring the imminent danger in favor of his objective. Meanwhile, in the mansion above the mine, the gravity of the situation was realized. The underground crisis threatened to get out of control and demanded immediate attention. A subordinate reported the scenario with evident despair. He feared that the swordsman's physical resistance was reaching its limit against such a vast number of creatures. The lord of the property acted with urgency. He opened the doors abruptly, refusing to remain passive while disaster unfolded on his lands. The subordinate hurried to adjust the straps of his armor. The emergency demanded full combat readiness, and there was no time to lose. Back in the darkness, Lloyd slid nimbly through the rugged terrain. He reasoned that the presence of coal necessarily indicated the existence of hidden methane gas pockets. Surrounded by the monsters, the young man kept his focus on his explosive goal. Finding the gas would mean a unique chance to detonate the entire enemy colony at once. Lloyd waved the torch frantically to keep the creatures at bay. The situation was critical, and he had no time to waste on distractions. The pair found themselves completely surrounded by the swarm. While Javier fended off the attacks with his blade, the noble used the fire and shovel to create a security perimeter. The continuous effort began to weigh on the swordsman. Javier shouted, forcing his muscles to the limit to keep the defensive barrier impenetrable. Suddenly, a peculiar energy emanated from Lloyd. His eyes glowed intensely as he activated his analysis skill amidst the chaos of battle. He identified the target and ordered an immediate advance. Cutting through the horde, the pair forced their way to a new strategic position. The torch in his hand burned vigorously. That fire was not just a weapon, but the centerpiece of the risky plan they were about to execute. Javier remained alert, watching his companion's focused behavior. He prepared his sword, ready to cover any move the noble made. Lloyd's skill scanned the underground terrain. A luminous interface projected onto the ground, revealing the geological structure and the exact point for excavation. Without hesitating, he plunged the shovel into the hard rock. The impact resonated, marking the beginning of the crucial phase of his plan. While Lloyd focused entirely on digging, Javier took over the protection of the rear. The swordsman became a living shield, blocking the beasts that tried to approach. The noble worked with superhuman speed. Driven by adrenaline, he frantically removed earth, deepening the hole every second. However, the number of enemies was overwhelming. One of the giant ants managed to break through the defense and advance directly against the exposed digger. Javier noticed the imminent danger behind him. He spun his body instantly, preparing to intercept the fatal threat. With a precise and devastating movement, the swordsman cut the creature in half. The attack protected Lloyd, ensuring that the excavation continued without interruption. The hole was finally ready. Surrounded by the relentless horde, they now possessed the tactical advantage that Lloyd sought so much in the cave floor. The ground beneath their feet trembled violently. Both stopped, feeling a disturbance much greater than the swarm they had been fighting. From the shadows emerged a living nightmare. The queen of the anthill revealed herself, a colossal monstrosity that completely dominated the tunnel. Lloyd stared at the beast, the shock showing on his face. The scale of that creature defied any logic he could conceive. The situation escalated from dangerous to catastrophic. The giant insect loomed over them, surrounded by its infinite offspring, blocking any escape route. Panic threatened to overwhelm the noble, but his guardian silenced him immediately. There was no room for doubts or complaints at that critical moment. Javier steeled his resolve, ignoring the fear. He knew he was the only shield between that monster and his employer. The beast didn't wait for preparations. It charged with terrifying speed, aiming to crush the intruders with a single devastating blow. The swordsman intercepted the attack. Energy exploded as steel met carapace, creating a shockwave through the cave. The impact was immense. Javier held his ground, his entire body tensing to withstand the crushing weight of the monster's onslaught. The creature hissed, frustrated by the unexpected resistance. It applied even more force to its jaws, determined to snap its prey in half. Sweat streamed down Javier's face as he gritted his teeth. Every muscle screamed under the pressure of the deadly stalemate. With a precise technique, he managed to deflect the colossal head to the side, buying a precious fraction of a second. Meanwhile, Lloyd ignored the battle completely. He dug with the frenzy of a madman, knowing that their survival depended solely on his shovel. Javier became a blur of motion. He parried blow after blow, dancing a deadly waltz to keep the monster's attention focused on him. Suddenly, the rhythm of the digging changed. Lloyd stopped, his expression shifting as he realized the shovel had finally hit its intended target. The monstrous ant queen loomed over them, a colossal threat ready to crush any resistance. Lloyd stared at the beast, understanding that this was the critical moment, while Javier prepared in the rear. The creature crashed down with full force, making the cave shake violently. In an instant reflex, the swordsman and the noble leaped in opposite directions, narrowly escaping the crushing impact. The tunnel floor opened up, revealing a nightmare in the depths. A sea of smaller ants awaited. The path seemed blocked, but for Lloyd, this was part of the ideal scenario. Without losing a second, the pair moved. While Javier kept his guard up with his blade, the young noble advanced with a torch in hand, ready to execute his insane plan. Lloyd twisted his body, concentrating all his strength in his arm. His gaze burned with manic determination, preparing to deliver the final blow that would change the course of the battle. With a cry of defiance, he hurled the torch directly into the dark abyss. It wasn't just a source of light, but an explosive gift destined for the hungry creatures below. The improvised projectile hit its target with comical precision, ricocheting off the giant ant's hard shell before continuing its fatal trajectory towards the bottom. The flames swirled through the air, descending into the heart of the anthill. The smaller creatures watched the light, not understanding that this small spark signaled the imminent end of them all. The queen realized the danger too late, reacting with impotent fury. Lloyd, now vulnerable on the ground, simply watched, awaiting the outcome of his risky gamble. The fire found the accumulated fuel in the tunnel. A vortex of flames roared instantly, turning the underground darkness into an incandescent inferno that consumed everything around it. The accumulated pressure detonated with extreme violence. A shockwave swept through the cave, obliterating the swarm's defenses in an explosion of light and heat. The force of the detonation engulfed the gigantic ant, throwing it backwards. In the midst of the chaos, Javier acted on instinct, moving to protect his master from the overwhelming force they themselves had unleashed. The tunnel turned into the mouth of a cannon, spewing fire and destruction. The horde that once seemed invincible was reduced to ashes before Lloyd's brutal trap. The blinding light and intense heat filled every crack in the cave. There was no room for escape. The destruction was absolute, sweeping away any trace of the monsters. As the dust began to settle, reality set in. Javier had used his own body as a human shield, protecting Lloyd from the debris and the impact, ensuring the noble's survival at any cost. The observers stared at the dark abyss that formed after the collapse. The dull sound of destruction still echoed, leaving everyone apprehensive about what had occurred in the depths. Amidst the chaos, one of the men cried out desperately, trying to locate the young noble. Panic was evident as he searched for any sign of life in the confusion. The dust finally settled, revealing Lloyd and Javier sprawled on the rocky ground. The force of the explosion had been devastating, leaving both unconscious among the rubble of the cave. A high-pitched buzzing filled Lloyd's ears as he regained consciousness. He tried to get up, feeling every muscle in his body protest against the recent impact. Looking ahead, he confirmed the result of his insane plan. The gigantic ant queen was buried under tons of rock, neutralized by the induced collapse. However, the victory came at a high price. Lloyd turned his attention to Javier, who remained motionless beside him after using his own body as a shield to protect him. He gathered his small summoned creature with trembling hands. The magical being had also suffered the consequences of that reckless act, appearing completely stunned. Suddenly, Lloyd's guilty expression turned to alertness. Something in the structure of the cave caught his attention, interrupting his thoughts. He examined the surroundings and realized the gravity of the situation. The escape route they planned to use had also collapsed, trapping them in that stone tomb. The dizziness returned with force, making the world spin, but Lloyd forced himself to stand. He gripped his shovel firmly, refusing to give up there. His eyes glowed with an intense green light. He activated his structural analysis skill, desperately seeking a solution through the solid rock. The special vision revealed a possibility, but the challenge was immense. There was a thick wall of compacted earth separating them from safety, requiring brutal physical effort. Without losing a single second, the young noble plunged the shovel into the ground. He ignored the pain and exhaustion, beginning to dig with a manic determination. The rhythmic sound of digging awakened Javier. With blurred vision and a heavy body, the swordsman watched his lord working tirelessly to save them. Lloyd continued to remove the earth with quick and precise movements. He knew that their survival now depended solely on the speed of his shovel. Lloyd's body finally gave in to exhaustion, collapsing against the stone ground. The physical exertion of the battle and the digging took its toll. His breathing was ragged and heavy. Every muscle ached, begging for a moment of rest that he knew he couldn't afford. However, something interrupted his collapse. A message from the system appeared in his vision, alerting him to a possibility of immediate evolution. The fatigue was cast aside. The young noble rose again, holding his shovel, as a new determination and a strange energy enveloped him. A sly smile curved his lips. He knew that conventional training took years, but the system offered him a shortcut that he intended to exploit to the fullest. Without hesitation, he selected the option presented. Lloyd decided to merge his current skills, investing his points to create the Azrahan core technique. The effect was instantaneous. A wave of power coursed through his body, physically manifesting around him as the new technique integrated into his being. He felt the change occur deeply, with the mana circulating and resonating directly in his heart. His energy core was being rewritten. The feeling of growing power was intoxicating. Lloyd realized that his body was reacting positively to the change, recovering its lost vigor. Upon checking the panel, he noticed that he possessed a vast reserve of reputation points. The cost to continue evolving was insignificant compared to what he had accumulated. He saw no reason to save. With a firm touch, he ordered the system to level up the newly acquired skill. The aura around him intensified. Lloyd remained firm, absorbing each increment of power that the system granted him. The process became mechanical and fast. He continued to press the enhancement button repeatedly, ignoring the cost of points. In a frenzied sequence, Lloyd raised the technique level after level. He was burning his resources to transform years of training into seconds of evolution. The cycle of enhancements finally ceased with a success notification. However, something sudden interrupted his celebration, capturing his immediate attention. The newly acquired energy manifested in the air with a sharp buzz. The skill fusion process had been completed successfully. Lloyd felt the new power course through his exhausted muscles. The fatigue that had previously dominated him was momentarily suppressed by a wave of vitality. He took a deep breath, assimilating the internal changes. The system had responded to his massive investment of points, preparing his body for the hard work. His fingers closed around the shovel handle with renewed firmness. The tool now seemed like a natural extension of his own arm. With a shout of effort, the young noble channeled mana through the tool. The air around crackled with the intensity of the accumulated energy. Then he began to dig. His movements became a blur of speed, attacking the earth with a swiftness that defied logic. His eyes gleamed with a manic determination. Lloyd gave himself fully to the work, striking the ground with relentless ferocity. His processing ability projected a structural analysis onto the rock. The system highlighted the geological faults with mathematical precision. Guided by this vision, he struck the cave wall. Each impact of the shovel was calculated to cause maximum structural damage. He advanced without hesitation, piercing the stone barrier. The resistance of the material was insignificant in the face of his enhanced technique. Lloyd's focus was absolute. His special vision tracked the stress lines in the rock, ignoring the sweat that dripped down his face. Suddenly, the final target revealed itself. The system locked its sights on the critical point that would make the entire obstacle collapse. A final barrage of devastating blows struck the wall. The earth and stone gave way, being removed at a mind-boggling pace. On the ground, Javier regained consciousness, dazed. Beside the small creature, the swordsman watched in disbelief at his master's display of brute force. Lloyd interrupted the frenzy for a second, breathing with difficulty. Adrenaline coursed through his veins, but he knew he couldn't stop. Lloyd let out a guttural cry, channeling every last drop of energy into his arms. Sweat poured down as he prepared to strike the merciless rock once more. The system interface glowed in the darkness, analyzing the density of the wall. The diagnosis was clear. There were still 3 meters of solid stone separating them from the objective. His legs, trembling from excessive exertion, finally gave way. The impact of his knees against the hard ground echoed through the silent cave. Without the strength to maintain his grip, the tool slipped from his fingers. The metallic sound of the shovel hitting the stones marked the temporary end of his resistance. The time limit of the skill had expired, leaving him vulnerable. Lloyd gasped heavily, feeling the crushing weight of exhaustion fall upon his hunched shoulders. Javier watched the scene in silence, witnessing his companion's collapse. Even the small creature seemed to have fainted, overcome by the fatigue of that absurd undertaking. However, Lloyd's stubbornness was greater than his body. With a manic and desperate look, he ignored the pain, grabbing the shovel again to continue the work. The tunnel was filled with a new wave of frenzy. Lloyd attacked the wall with a mind-boggling speed, striking the rock repeatedly in a violent trance. The brutal persistence began to yield results. The system updated the scan, indicating that the impassable barrier had been reduced to a mere 30 centimeters. But that last burst of energy took its final toll. The young noble's body locked up and he plummeted backward, unable to stay on his feet. Lloyd lay on the ground, his face pale and covered in dust. His consciousness seemed to flicker, completely drained by the superhuman effort he had just made. He remained sprawled on the cold earth, motionless beside his tool. Silence returned to the tunnel, suggesting he had reached his absolute limit. His eyes, though open, seemed glazed and unfocused. The exhaustion was so profound that he could barely register his surroundings. It was then that the wall in front of him began to react. Before Lloyd's stunned gaze, the solid rock began to crack and crumble. The final barrier exploded into pieces. From within the cloud of dust, the small creature emerged triumphant, finishing the job with a dramatic entrance. Lloyd smiled almost maniacally, sweat dripping down his face. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but the satisfaction of completing the task kept him conscious. With his lungs burning, he shouted at the top of his lungs, celebrating the rush of fresh air that finally invaded the suffocating environment. That moment was the result of pure determination. He had dug tirelessly, moved by the promise of a future that depended on that success. The rock barrier had finally given way, revealing the serene night landscape of the outside world, free from the darkness of the cave. Suddenly, the orange glow of a torch cut through the dimness of the tunnel, signaling the approach of other people. The fiefdom's soldiers rushed through the open passage, anxiously calling for their lord as they lit the way. The knight in the lead stopped abruptly, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of life among the rubble. From the deep shadows, Javier emerged walking with difficulty, carrying Lloyd's inert body on his back. The silver-haired swordsman could barely stand. Both had surpassed their extreme physical limits through pure improvisation and will. Upon recognizing his master's critical situation, the knight cried out in panic and rushed to assist them. However, Javier's strength was completely exhausted, and his knees buckled under the weight of accumulated fatigue. The knight arrived in time to support them, preventing the swordsman and the noble from collapsing violently against the rocky ground. The commotion gave way to the silence of the night, watched only by the full moon and the sound of nocturnal life. The next day dawned radiant over the valley, illuminating the lands of the fiefdom with a renewed peace. In the village, the servants talked about the recent events, admitting with surprise that they had misjudged Lloyd's character. News about the incident in the mine spread quickly throughout the fiefdom. It was said that, faced with the danger of the giant ants, the young noble prioritized the evacuation of the workers without hesitation. In the bustling streets, the residents discussed the details with disbelief. It seemed impossible to them that only 2 people had eliminated the entire threat and resolved the situation alone. Public perception of the heir was changing drastically. That selfless man looked nothing like the infamous Lord Lloyd that everyone knew and feared in the past. Meanwhile, in the tranquility of his chambers, the protagonist recovered his energies in a deep sleep. Javier, however, remained vigilant beside the bed, standing silent guard. The young noble seemed completely exhausted, immersed in a heavy rest after the superhuman physical effort performed in the caves. Suddenly, the silver-haired swordsman's attention was captured by a subtle change in the environment, interrupting his vigil. A holographic window materialized directly over Lloyd's face, waking him from his sleep with a luminous notification about rewards for his heroic deeds. Still half asleep, he focused his gaze on the floating message, quickly processing the content of the warning that the system presented to him. Upon understanding the profit obtained, any trace of tiredness disappeared. A greedy and satisfied smile curved Lloyd's lips instantly.